Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into a world where survival didn't come from GPS apps or filtered water bottles, but from rotten bread, cold suspicion, and maybe a little divine luck. We're heading back to the medieval period, where the streets were cobbled, the air probably smelled like goat, and you, yes, you probably won't survive this. Not because you're not smart or resourceful, but because medieval life was a masterclass in daily near-death experiences. It's wild that anyone made it out alive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your city and what time you're watching this in the comments. I love seeing how far these bedtime wanderings travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a dirt path in a medieval village. Not the postcard kind, but the real kind. Muddy streets, thatched roofs, chickens that definitely don't respect boundaries. The year's somewhere in the 14th century, and something's not quite right. Your neighbours are twitchy. The baker's wife is muttering under her breath, and everyone's avoiding the bread. That's your first clue. You grab a chunk anyway, because you're starving, and the moment it touches your tongue, you pause. There's something odd about it. Not just stale, tangy. Wrong. Within hours, your fingers twitch uncontrollably. You feel feverish, you start hallucinating. A green knight rides through your dreams with 100 legs. You're not dying, yet. But you've just encountered what modern scholars now believe was ergot poisoning, the result of eating rye infected with a funky little fungus called Claviceps purpurea. They just knew that certain bread made people lose their minds. It hit hardest in wet summers, especially when the grain wasn't dried properly. Villagers called it St. Anthony's fire, because of the burning sensations in the limbs. If you were lucky, you sweated it out. If you weren't, well, you might lose a few toes, or your mind. Now here's the weird thing, over time people started to notice. The bread looked off, darker with weird purplish black spots. Some communities even developed rudimentary bread inspectors, not official ones mind you, but nosy aunties who'd poke at loaves with sticks and hiss warnings at anyone who dared slice in. So in a weird crowdsourced way, this psychedelic tragedy helped people develop a kind of early food safety system. Not foolproof, but better than nothing when your life expectancy hovers around 30. Want an even stranger twist? Some modern scholars think outbreaks of ergot poisoning may have fueled mass hysteria. The dancing plagues, the witch hunts, the sudden visions and violent convulsions. Imagine an entire town tripping on toxic rye. It sounds funny, until you realise that the possessed girl in the woods might just be a malnourished teen with a fungus problem. There's a whole debate over whether events like the Salem witch trials were influenced by this. Did the devil visit New England, or did mouldy bread do the trick? Historians don't agree, but it's deliciously unsettling either way. You walk away from the village bakery, tossing the cursed bread to the pigs who will probably eat anything. As you head past the market stalls, you see old women sniffing grain sacks and shaking their heads. You catch on, smell matters, colour matters, bread can lie, it can also kill. And yet you can't help but notice the resilience. The fact that these folks, illiterate, superstitious and constantly under threat, figured out in time how to detect invisible dangers. They learned to spot the off-colour of infected grain, the bitterness of a bad batch, the unlucky curve of a rye stalk. They didn't have lab tests, but they had stories, patterns and gut feelings passed down through generations. You, of course, are a modern person with access to food safety inspections, refrigeration and oat milk lattes. But out here, in the damp heart of medieval life, you're realising that sometimes surviving isn't about strength, it's about noticing things. You start watching people more closely, what they eat, what they avoid, who starts scratching after supper, and so your first secret's locked in. Don't eat the bread unless you know the baker. Watch them grind the grain, and maybe said a prayer or two over the oven. One more thing. That same fungus. Centuries later, scientists would synthesize it into something else. Something you may have heard of, LSD. Yeah, that's the same chemical family. So that green knight from your hallucination? He may have been the original rave poster. Just saying. Anyway, you're lucky tonight. You recover. You're shaky. But alive. Someone gives you a bowl of lentils and tells you to lie down near the hearth. You do. The fire crackles. Outside, the village dogs howl at something unseen. And you begin to understand. Out here, survival isn't guaranteed. It's a negotiation. One meal, one fever, one strange loaf of bread at a time. You wake up to the sound of distant hooves and a rooster who's clearly misunderstood his one job. The air is cool, thick with wood smoke and wet earth. As you stretch and rub the grit from your eyes, the woman who let you sleep near the hearth last night shoves a chunk of dry cheese into your hand. "You should be moving before midday," she warns. They? You step outside and scan the woods beyond the edge of the village. Shadows twitch, but maybe it's just the breeze through the birch leaves. Still, her warning isn't just local paranoia, it's part of a deeply ingrained survival instinct. Always assume you're being watched. Because honestly, you probably are. Out here, everyone learns early that travelling unarmed or unaware is a gamble. Knights and bandits alike roam the roads, and sometimes it's hard to tell them apart. Even the wealthiest nobles, armoured and mounted, didn't ride without backup, and they definitely didn't relax their grip on the reins when crossing a tree-lined road. Surprise attacks were the medieval version of jump scares, only with actual consequences. So you find yourself walking the rutted trail with your head on a swivel. That's not paranoia, it's protocol. You pass a man herding goats, and he gives you a nod, eyes lingering just a second too long. Friend or threat? Hard to say. You remember the first trick you picked up watching the knights come through town last spring? Shields offer more than protection. They're early warning systems. The curve of the shield, positioned just so on the left arm, reflects movement at the edge of your peripheral vision. You catch a glint? Someone's there. You hear a twig snap? Drop to one knee and scan the tree line. Even the shiniest coat of arms served a dual purpose: visibility, intimidation, and most importantly, making sure the guy sneaking up on you sees that you're not alone. You don't have a shield, not yet, but your eyes do a pretty good job. You start noting signs, broken twigs in the wrong direction, crow calls cutting short, that sick feeling in your gut like something's off. Congratulations, you're developing situational awareness, a skill that meant the difference between seeing your next birthday or becoming some bandit's coin purse. Back in town, people whisper about the local woods being cursed. A century ago, maybe a monastery burned down there, or a noblewoman went mad and vanished into the trees. Whatever the story, one thing's true: anyone who's careless in the forest usually disappears. And here's the quirky bit. Some knights, especially during crusades, would attach tiny bells to their horses' gear, or even their own belts. Not to be festive, but because the soft jingling forced them to stay alert. When the bell stopped, that meant something was wrong. A lost horse, a fallen comrade, a silent threat. Imagine moving through a silent field, then suddenly the bells vanish behind you. That's when you draw your sword, or run. You start to notice that every traveller has a rhythm to their movement. Loud people are distracting. But the real survivors, they're quiet, calculated, walking like they know something you don't. Some keep their cloaks wrapped around their arms, concealing weapons. Others carry walking sticks with hollowed-out compartments, daggers, sometimes vials of something worse. Every step is theatre, every moment a potential ambush. Scholars still debate how much training the average medieval soldier received. Some say it was rigorous, almost ritualistic. Others argue that peasant levies were rushed into battle with little more than pitchforks and prayers. But one thing's clear: those who survived multiple campaigns, they learned to read the land like a book. Not just tracks, but bird patterns, cloud shifts, the scent of metal in the air. A battlefield was just a forest with worse lighting and more yelling. You're not a soldier, but walking these paths you begin to understand why people grew up knowing how to spot danger. It wasn't paranoia, it was passed down wisdom. Grandpa might not be able to read, but he can tell you exactly what kind of boot made that print in the mud and how long ago. Midday passes and the road dips into a shallow valley. A merchant wagon lies toppled near the side, wheels splintered, cargo gone. You freeze. The scene's quiet. Too quiet. You crouch low and scan for movement. A dead horse slumps in the brush, and you catch the faint glimmer of something sharp near the tree line. Yeah, bandits. You back away slowly. That old woman was right. They do watch from the trees. You don't make it back to town. You cut across the fields, hugging hedgerows and ducking behind haystacks like it's a stealth mission. Your heart's hammering. You're not a hero. You're just trying not to die before dinner. When you finally reach a safe farmhouse, the old man sharpening his sickle just grunts at you. He asks. You nod. They never take the sacks of flour, he mutters. Then he shrugs. Should have had a decoy shield. Decoy shield? Apparently some travellers carried mock shields, painted canvas stretched over wood, mimicking the emblems of powerful lords. They couldn't actually block an arrow, but they could make you look connected, or dangerous. or not worth the hassle. A fake coat of arms could save your life, if no one called your bluff. The man invites you to sleep in his hayloft. Keep your boots on, he warns. You thank him and climb the ladder, nestling into itchy straw with a knife tucked under your tunic, just in case. And so tonight's lesson settles in. Out here, defense starts long before the fight. You don't wait for trouble, you read the signs, you watch the trees, and if you're lucky, you walk away before the arrows start flying. Dawn is a cold breath on your face, and the smell of something vaguely wet and bovine floats up from the barn below. You didn't sleep much. Every rustle made your heart stutter. But you're alive, and in the Middle Ages, that counts as a small miracle. You drop down from the loft, boots already laces tight, and thank the old man. He grunts and hands you a wrapped bundle of something heavy and sloshing, his version of breakfast. You peek inside, a leather flask and a chunk of coarse bread. You lift the flask, expecting water. What hits your nose is earthy, yeasty, a little sour. Definitely not water, it's beer. Or more precisely small beer, the stuff even kids drank day in, day out. Because in the medieval world, clean water was a dicey gamble. Wells were often shared with animals. Rivers were used for everything, and yes, everything means what you think it does. Water could carry disease like a Trojan horse made of diarrhea. But beer had been boiled, fermented, transformed. Brewing killed off most of the nasty stuff, and the alcohol, though low, added a little antiseptic muscle. And small beer wasn't your weekend IPA. It was watered down, barely alcoholic, meant for hydration more than celebration. If you had a family, even your 5-year-old drank it with breakfast. Cheers. You swig it, wincing at the taste. It's not awful, it's just medieval. And yet, with each sip, you get a deeper appreciation for the survival math at play. Boil water, eels live longer. Add grain, it's to feed yourself. Let it sit just long enough, it was safe to drink. People figured this out through trial, error, and probably a few funerals. You wander into the village centre, watching as a few women hang laundry between crooked posts. A barrel of beer is being wheeled toward the church. Yes, the church. Because monks were the real MVPs of medieval brewing. Monasteries often had the cleanest beer and the most reliable recipes. They even developed methods for preserving it longer and distributing it during famines. For some towns, the local alehouse was more essential than the market square. And here's a curious twist. The amount of beer brewed each day was often regulated by law. Not to keep people sober, but to ensure no one was tempted to cut corners. Brewing bad beer wasn't just gross, it could kill you. Contaminated grain, poor hygiene, or skipped steps could mean poisoning an entire village. Some places even had ale tasters, officials who sampled each batch to check the quality. Honestly, not the worst job. Unless someone cheated the recipe, then you'd be the first to find out the hard way. You follow the smell of hops to a house where a young man is stirring a bubbling pot over an open fire. His brew. He's added nettles, maybe rosemary, and something you can't place. Wormwood, he mutters, seeing your homer look. Whether he means literal demons or just dysentery is unclear, but you respect the hustle. Of course, this was before hops became the go-to stabilizer. Early medieval beers used all kinds of herbs and plants, some helpful, others slightly hallucinogenic. The ingredient list wasn't always about flavour. It was survival science mixed with a little superstition. The scholarly debate today, whether medieval folks actually preferred beer over water for the taste, or just drank it out of necessity. Some argue water sources weren't all bad. Others point out that records consistently show beer as the default drink at every meal, from field workers to royalty. Still, we can't ignore that context. When water kills and beer doesn't, the choice kind of makes itself. As you wander further into town, you pass a group of kids playing with sticks and shouting nonsense. They're drinking from clay cups, likely filled with, you guessed it, small beer. You take it. It's lighter, sweeter, with a hint of something spicy. Not bad, actually. A local woman laughs from her doorway. Better than what the last reeve served. She's exaggerating, but not by much. Brewing disasters happened. People experimented, sometimes too bravely. In some cases, certain fungal contaminated brews caused nausea, madness, or worse. And when that happened, the punishment wasn't mild. Brewing dangerous ale could lead to fines, exile, or if someone important died, something sharper. And yet beer saved lives. It kept people hydrated. It was portable, affordable, and when made properly, remarkably consistent. Some towns kept a communal brewing schedule. Others required inns to keep a minimum supply on hand for travellers. Beer was more than culture, it was infrastructure. A lifeline in a world where clean was a theory. You sit on a stone wall, sipping the last of your morning brew, stomach full enough to move again. And it hits you, this isn't just about preference. It's engineering, social, agricultural, even architectural. Many homes were designed with space for brewing. Monasteries had entire wings dedicated to it. Cities taxed it, kings depended on it. The medieval world might not have trusted its water, but it bet everything on barley. Before you leave, you peek inside the local alehouse. It's dim, warm, with long benches and an almost sweet smell. Two men argue about grain prices while a woman behind the bar measures out today's batch. No mugs, just communal cups, often shared among patrons. You don't stay. You've got roads to walk and more secrets to find, but as you step back into the light, the taste of hops still on your tongue, you realise something simple. In the Middle Ages, beer wasn't a luxury or a party. It was the most drinkable insurance policy around. The village fades behind you as you follow a narrow dirt path leading uphill. Your feet slip a little on the frost-covered leaves, and the wind carries a sharpness that tastes like the edge of winter. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and wish, for the 100th time, that someone back in town had mentioned just how cold the countryside gets. But the real surprise hits you as the sun rises higher and reveals the homes scattered across the hilltop. Most of them have no windows, at least not the kind you're used to. Just wooden shutters, closed tight, gaps stuffed with straw rags or wattle. Light doesn't get in, but neither does the cold, or worse. It's not just about modesty or cost. These houses are sealed up on purpose, and as you step into one of them, a one-room cottage you're invited into by a friendly shepherd, you realise just how much the air outside burns compared to the stale, smoky warmth within. The fire crackles low and you can barely see across the room through the haze, but it's warm, it's still. And that, it turns out, was the point. Because in the medieval world, open windows meant open sickness. We're talking about a time before germ theory, yes, but not a time before pattern recognition. People noticed. When the weather shifted and the cold wind blew in, people fell sick. When they left their shutters open too long, children coughed and old people stopped waking up. The houses of the poor were primitive, sure, but survival was baked into the design, literally. The idea was to seal the bad air out, not let the breeze freshen things up. A draft wasn't refreshing, it was deadly. You glance around, no chimney, just a hole in the roof where smoke can trickle out. Walls are made from mud and straw, thick enough to keep out the wind. The air inside? Oh. It's hot, damp, smoky, and smells like wet wool and onions, but it's still a sanctuary. You start to understand why people were suspicious of fresh air. In their world, illness didn't come from invisible microbes, it came from miasma. Bad air, foul humours, smells were indicators of corruption, so naturally, you tried to keep those smells far from your lungs. Your host, a wiry man with hands like twisted rope, explains how they winter down. In the cold months, he says, the shutters stay closed day and night. The door is only opened briefly, once at sunrise, once at sunset. Inside, people huddle close. They cook, sleep, work, and even keep small animals in with them. Chickens, sometimes a goat. It's like living inside a giant steaming pot of soup. But it works, most of the time. Here's the kicker. While wealthy nobles built stone houses with real windows, some even with glass, their homes were colder, draftier, and more prone to letting in bad air. And because they often lived in tighter, more crowded conditions, plague spread faster in castles than in peasant huts. Irony has a long, rich history. Meanwhile, the poor, crammed into these sealed little ovens, had fewer visitors, fewer drafts, and in some cases, fewer outbreaks. It wasn't scientific, but it was survival. Scholars still debate how effective these tactics were. Did sealing the house actually help? Or did the stagnant air make things worse? There's no clear answer. But given the choices available, you can't really blame them for choosing warmth and insulation over risky ventilation. Your shepherd friend points to the ceiling where soot blackens the rafters. That's how you know it's working, he jokes. He's half joking. A constantly smoking grille meant constant warmth, and soot covered everything was the price of not freezing to death. In the corner of the room, a woman stirs something thick and bubbling in a pot. It smells like barley, maybe with cabbage or wild herbs. The entire house runs on this single fire. It cooks, it heats, it dries clothes, it warms water. You notice how the furniture is arranged. Everything low to the ground, huddled around the hearth. Beds are straw pallets stacked together. Everyone sleeps side by side, kids, parents, grandparents. Privacy? Not a concept. Survival? The only concept. And here's a fringe fact. Some families deliberately smoke their homes, as in intentionally filled them with smoke as a way to purify the air. Certain herbs were tossed into the fire, juniper, mugwort or pine needles, not for scent but for spiritual cleansing. Evil spirits, people believed, didn't like thick smoke. Neither did fleas or lice, which is honestly fair. But back to the windows, more accurately, the lack thereof. Some homes had simple shutters made of cloth or hide, greased to repel wind. Others used animal bladders stretched over frames, letting in light while keeping out the cold. Glass? A luxury. And even then, most glass was cloudy, warped or coloured. Seeing outside wasn't the point. Keeping your insides warm and your lungs clean, that was the mission. You sit down near the fire and watch as the woman hands you a steaming bowl of stew. You thank her, still shivering slightly, and realise how long you've gone without real warmth. The soup is thick and salty, probably made from whatever was left in the pantry. It's delicious, or maybe you're just grateful not to be chewing on mouldy bread again. You take it all in. The walls are coated in a faint layer of grime, the ceiling sags under years of accumulated soot, and the floor is mostly packed earth. But there's something beautiful about the way it all works together. This space isn't about comfort. It's about not dying, about making it through one more winter. And when you view it through that lens, every sealed shutter and smoky rafter starts to look like genius. As the day wanes, you thank your hosts and step back into the cold. The air outside hits you like a sap, and suddenly, the smoky warmth of that windowless room feels like paradise. You glance back once, noting how the house seems to sink into the hill, part of the earth itself, discreet, defensible, as insulated by design. You walk on, taking one more survival secret with you. When in doubt, shut the windows, seal the cracks, and trust that the air outside might be worse than the smoke within. You trudge into the next village just as the sun begins to dip behind the trees, painting everything in dull bronze. The houses here are clustered a little tighter, and the people glance up at you with that particular mix of suspicion and curiosity reserved for strangers who arrive right before supper. You nod politely, try not to look threatening, which is hard when your cloak smells like smoke, beer, and at least 3 kinds of animal, and settle yourself near the central well, pretending you have business. That's when you notice it. The clothes. Not what they are, but what colour they're not. Everyone seems to be wearing the same muted palette, earthy browns, greys and dull greens. Even the wealthier-looking woman walking from the church is dressed in faded blue, not bright or flashy. It's not exactly a fashion statement. It's a warning system, and you're just starting to read it. In the Middle Ages, colour wasn't just aesthetic, it was code. Dyes were expensive, sure, and the brighter the colour, the wealthier the wearer. But beyond social class, colours were used to communicate something far more urgent: status, danger and health. And in a world where the plague wasn't just folklore but a recurring nightmare, the wrong hue could get you chased out of town, or worse. A small boy passes you wearing a mustard-coloured tunic with a frayed edge. It's stained near the collar, and the woman walking behind him makes a show of keeping her distance. You ask an older man what it means, and he leans in, voice low. "That family's had fever," he mutters. He eyes the child, and there it is, colour coding for survival. In some towns, especially during outbreaks, authorities or even local churches would require anyone recovering from illness to wear specific colours. Yellow was the most common, signalling sickness, but not necessarily plague. In fact, some cities during the Black Death required suspected victims or exposed families to mark their doors with yellow crosses or ribbons. It was meant to protect others, but it also had the effect of branding people like livestock. And not just yellow. Red could mean pestilence or uncleanliness. White, ironically, was often associated with lepers or the spiritually impure. Even the choice of trim or hood could signify affiliation, status, or risk. Travellers who wanted to move unnoticed often wore muddied browns and greens, blending into both the woods and the social background. Bright colours drew attention, and attention in the medieval world was rarely good. You start noticing other things. A woman with a dark red kerchief walks the edge of the square, never stepping too close to the well. People nod to her but keep a step of distance. Not fear, necessarily, just respect for the code. She's in mourning. Her husband likely died this winter, and until her household is clean again, She won't eat communally or touch shared tools, not because someone told her not to, but because centuries of hard lessons taught these people how to self-isolate without needing a microbiology degree. You sit near the hearth of the local tavern that night, paying with a carved token someone told you was worth a pint and a place to warm your boots. Inside, it's louder, looser. People laugh, drink, and lean in close. But you notice they still follow the colour cues. A man in a freshly dyed green tunic sits by the door. He's a forester, probably healthy, and his colour signals utility. No one hesitates to shake his hand. The tavern keeper, meanwhile, wears a clean apron dyed with a dark blue stripe. She's in charge, yes, but more importantly, blue signified trustworthiness, especially in guild colours. In some regions, brewers or cooks wore blue bands to indicate their membership in regulated guilds, sort of like a medieval health inspection sticker. The more consistent the colour, the more people trusted the food, and trust was survival currency. You overhear two men talking about a recent visitor who wore a pale robe and claimed to be a healer. More like a thief, one snorts. The other laughs, but the message is clear. Faking a colour code was a dangerous business. It could get you exiled, or worse, burned. The oddball fact? Some nobles and clergy tried to outlaw certain colour combinations for commoners, not for safety but for control. Sumptuary laws dictated who could wear what, right down to the type of fur on your cuffs. A peasant in scarlet could be accused of impersonating nobility, but people got crafty. They learned to layer meanings. Nuance in thread and colour. It was communication without words. Today, historians argue over how strictly these colour codes were enforced. Some say they were loose traditions, others claim they were the cornerstone of communal health policy. But the patterns are hard to ignore. During times of plague, famine, or religious upheaval, colour became a language, spoken in linen, wool and dye. You get your cup of weak ale and sit near the fire, watching the way people arrange themselves. Certain colours cluster near the hearth, others stay near the windows. There's no chart posted, no announcements made, but everyone knows the rules. And now, so do you. As you leave the tavern, a young girl selling herbs waves you down. She's wearing a tattered green sash and her hands are stained with something dark, maybe woad or elderberry. "For protection," she says, holding up a sprig of something sharp and fragrant. You hesitate. She grins. It's a trick question, of course. No colour stops death, but knowing which ones signal danger might just buy you another sunrise. You take the herb anyway, tuck it into your belt and move on into the night, eyes sharper, cloak held close, and your mind filing away this quiet lesson. In the Middle Ages, if you couldn't read or write, your safety still depended on knowing what colours to fear. You wake to the unmistakable scent of burning pine. Not the cosy kind, like from last night's hearth, but sharp, smoky, and urgent. Someone's fire is out of control. You bolt upright from your sleeping spot in the stables, heart thumping and squint through the cracks in the boards. A thick column of smoke spirals up from the edge of the village. But no one is panicking. No screams, no chaos. Just a few villagers walking briskly, purposefully toward the smoke. You follow them, curiosity pushing you faster than fear. As you near the source, you find the culprit. A chimney belching black smoke from a house with a collapsed section of roof. The fire is mostly under control now, but it's the chimney that catches your attention. It's oddly placed, not in the centre, but on the side of the house, and it's tall. Much taller than you'd expect for a humble cottage. And that, it turns out, might have saved their lives. In the medieval world, chimneys weren't just for smoke, they were early survival tech. And like most medieval inventions, they were a long, awkward work in progress. Early medieval homes didn't have chimneys at all, just a hole in the roof, if you were lucky. Smoke filled the room, rose slowly, and drifted out, or didn't. You breathed it. You slept in it. Babies were born into it. Coughing was just part of life. Then someone figured out that building a flue to direct the smoke out, not just up, could actually keep your lungs clearer and reduce the risk of fire setting your thatched roof ablaze. The placement mattered. The angle mattered. And most of all, the materials mattered. A stone chimney was ideal but expensive, a brick one, cheaper but prone to cracks, and a wooden flue lined with clay, risky but better than nothing. You stand beside a wiry man scraping ash from the damaged hearth. He tells you the fire started from a build-up in the chimney shaft. "Should have cleaned it," he mutters. His wife frowns at him from the doorway. The look says this isn't the first time. But here's what's interesting. Their chimney was tall, and that height created a draft strong enough to keep most of the fire shooting upward instead of back into the room. It probably saved their family and the rest of the village from a full-blown disaster. Chimney design was an early form of passive fire prevention, but also, strangely, a kind of social signal. Only the more prosperous households had them in the earlier Middle Ages. Having a chimney wasn't just functional, it showed status. It meant your home had designated cooking space or even separate rooms, which hinted at wealth, hygiene, and even access to specialised labour. After all, building a chimney required skill. You couldn't just slap rocks together and hope the smoke went away. And here's a lesser-known tidbit. Some people actually feared chimneys when they first emerged. They saw them as unnatural holes in the house, portals where spirits or even witches could enter. There were stories of demons slithering down like smoke serpents, haunting families who dared to channel fire unnaturally. In some regions, charms were hung near the hearth to ward off whatever might try to slink in, but over time people adapted. Chimneys became not only common, but critical. They reduced indoor smoke, which, let's be honest, had been slowly suffocating generations. Chronic lung issues, probably linked to decades of cooking and sleeping in a low-ceilinged room with no ventilation. The chimney was a life-saving upgrade, even if it came centuries too late for a lot of peasants. Scholars debate whether medieval chimney use was widespread by the 12th century or still mostly elite until later. Evidence suggests rural homes were late adopters, and even then chimney fires were disturbingly common. That's why villagers developed strategies, scraping out soot regularly, burning certain herbs believed to clean the shaft, and even using trained children to shimmy up and scrub the inside. Yeah, chimney sweeps weren't just for the Victorian era. As the family patches their roof, a few men with buckets dump water on the scorched straw around the foundation. You notice they're talking about how lucky it was the wind didn't shift. One spark and half the town could have gone up. That's the thing about these villages. Everything's flammable. Wood beams, thatch, hay, clothes. Even the beds are stuffed with dry straw or wool. So fire isn't just a hazard, it's an existential threat. You think back to your own brief time in the soot-choked cottage. The way the smoke clung to your skin, the warmth, yes, but also the risk. No chimney. You might not freeze, but you'd cough yourself to sleep. A badly built chimney? You might wake up surrounded by flame. And then there's the trick some of the savvier villagers use. Smoke direction as a warning system. A chimney's smoke shifts with the wind, yes, but it can also be monitored. Certain smoke patterns might signal someone's home or not. A trader returning. A fire left burning in a supposedly abandoned house. In some border towns, watchmen learned to read chimney smoke like footprints, looking for unusual activity. It wasn't foolproof, but it was clever. You sit with the villagers as the sun continues to rise, sipping something hot and vaguely herbal from a clay cup. The air still smells, faintly scorched, but it's nothing compared to what could have been. You realise that chimneys, those stone and mortar afterthoughts we barely glance at today, were once cutting-edge, life-saving tech. The line between shelter and disaster often came down to the width of a flue, and whether someone remembered to scrape the soot. As the village returns to its rhythm, you shoulder your pack and nod to the family. You watch nearly lose everything. They give you a tired but grateful smile. Their home will be patched, their hearth rebuilt, and their sipo and their chimney probably cleaned more often. You walk away with one more secret tucked into your smoky clothes. In a world built of wood and hope, a well-made chimney might be the most important part of the house. You're on the road again. Boots soaked from the dew-drenched grass and your mind still turning over the smoky near-disaster from this morning. The scent of scorched thatch is gone now, replaced by the smells of damp leaves, manure, and something faintly fishy that you choose not to investigate further. You're winding your way along a hedgerow when you spot a small cottage set apart from the others, alone at the edge of the trees. Strange, you think. Why so isolated? You slow your pace. The house isn't abandoned. In fact, it's surprisingly well kept. But there's something off. The garden is overgrown in neat rows, too neat. No livestock, no smoke from the chimney. You're about to move on when a sudden hiss catches your attention. A cat. Sleek, jet black, glaring at you like it owns the land and you're a trespasser. Its yellow eyes don't blink. It doesn't run. It guards. And weirdly enough, that's how it's supposed to be. In the medieval world, cats were both feared and fiercely valued, a contradiction wrapped in fur. You approach the cottage slowly, keeping your eyes on the cat as it circles you like a tiny panther. You half expect it to start speaking in riddles. Here's the thing. Cats in the Middle Ages had a very weird PR team. Depending on where you were and when, They were either demonic familiars linked to witches or indispensable pest control that literally kept your family alive. Sometimes both on the same day. You spot another cat slinking out from behind a stack of wood, then a third perched high on the roof, its tail flicking lazily. This isn't a house with cats. This is a cat house. No, not that kind. A home protected by felines, and likely owned by someone smart enough to know what that meant. Because rats weren't just a nuisance in the medieval world, they were a death sentence. They chewed through grain stores, spoiled food, and worst of all carried fleas that carried the plague. And the only reliable line of defence, cats, silent, efficient, and terrifyingly good at their jobs. A single barn cat could mean the difference between eating through winter or starving. Or worse, dying of some fast-moving sickness you couldn't even name. You knock on the cottage door, not expecting an answer. But after a moment, an old woman opens it, wrapped in what looks like 7 different shawls. Her eyes are sharp, but not unkind. She sees you, then glances past your shoulder. They don't like strangers, she says. It takes you a second to realise she means the cats. You're invited in cautiously. The inside of her home is dim, packed with bundles of herbs, feathers tied with twine, and drying racks full of who knows what. She doesn't say it, but you can guess what people around here call her. Witch. Which, let's be clear, didn't necessarily mean evil spellcaster back then. It usually meant woman who knows things, especially things that scare people. She gestures for you to sit and offers you a strange tea, dark, bitter, but warming. The cats keep watch from every corner, eyes like lanterns in the dim light. You ask her about them, and she gives a short laugh. She's not wrong. In parts of Europe, particularly during the height of plague hysteria, cats were rounded up and killed in mass purges, especially black ones. Superstition painted them as witches' familiars or omens of death. But the dark irony. Removing cats led to surging rat populations and more outbreaks. Oops, there's still debate among historians about how directly those anti-cat purges impacted plague spread. But the timeline is damning. Fewer cats, more rats, more fleas. Sometimes ignorance has body count. You sip your tea and watch the way the cats move. One curls around your leg but doesn't settle, just tests your scent. Another jumps lightly onto the windowsill and stares out into the woods, alert. You get the sense that if anything tried to enter this house uninvited, rat, spirit or man, it wouldn't make it past the door. The woman points out a shelf of small clay jars. They bring me things, she says. Bones, teeth, shiny things. She laughs again, a dry sound. And honestly, maybe they do. Medieval people were no strangers to the supernatural. They believed in spirits, omens, curses, and they watched animals closely for signs. Cats were thought to walk between worlds, which sounds poetic until you realise it meant people often burned them alive during festivals, just in case. Sometimes as part of rituals meant to bring good luck. That's one way to send mixed messages. Still, others treated cats like honoured guests. In monasteries, monks kept them to protect sacred texts from mice. Some cats were even listed in household inventories, with names, values and descriptions. One 9th century Irish poem lovingly describes a monk's cat named Pangoban, who chased mice while the monk chased wisdom. So yeah, cats had fans. You thank the woman and rise to leave. The cats watch you again, but this time with less suspicion. One even follows you to the edge of the woods before vanishing into the brambles like a shadow with whiskers. You walk on thinking about how survival in the Middle Ages wasn't always about brute strength or luck. Sometimes it was about knowing which animals to befriend and which to fear, and sometimes they were the same animal. So here's your lesson for the day. Don't trust a cat, but don't live without one either. They may be mysterious, aloof, and possibly plotting your death, but they'll save your grain, protect your home, and just maybe keep the plague away. Just don't call them. They'll come when they want to. You wake to the sound of bells. Soft, distant, and eerily timed. Not church bells exactly, and not the warning kind you've heard before. This is subtler. It rings once, then again after a pause, then twice in quick succession. The pattern isn't random. Someone's telling someone else something. And the weird part? It's not even dawn yet. You roll over on your straw bed in the loft of a stranger's barn and blink up at the rafters, trying to remember where you are. Right, the little hamlet near the marshes, the one with the quiet fields and the cat-guarded cottage from yesterday. As the bells echo again, 3 short chimes, then silence. You decide you've got to know what that means. Outside, the mist hugs the ground like a sleeping creature, and the air smells faintly of peat and ash. The village is quiet but not asleep. You spot two boys walking toward the church, each carrying bundles of dried reeds. One stops to listen as the bell rings again. Neither looks alarmed, just tuned in. You follow them to the edge of the square, where a small wooden belfry stands, little more than a platform with a weathered rope dangling beneath a slanted roof. A man in his 50s stands beneath it, a simple wool cap pulled low over his ears. He watches the horizon as he rings the bell. One long toll, a pause, too short. Then he stops, listening for something in return, or you ask him, keeping your tone light. He shrugs, not unkindly. "Mist's too thick this morning." Another shrug. He glances at you. You admit it, he nods. That's the first time you truly understand just how powerful the village bell code was in medieval survival. It wasn't just for summoning people to church or warning of a fire. It was a language, one built on rhythm and repetition, passed down and memorized like sacred scripture. Everyone knew it. You had to. Because out here, with no phones, no written signs, and no town cries for miles, bells were the heartbeat of a community. You watch the man pull the rope again, just once this time. A single note that rolls through the mist and settles into the fields beyond. He nods to himself and walks away, leaving the bell swaying gently. No more rings, just silence. The message has been delivered. Later that day, you learn more about how it works. Each village had its own code, based on tone, number of tolls, spacing and repetition. Some bells were mounted high for maximum range, while others were low and closer to homes, meant for local signals. The patterns weren't complex, but they were specific. 3 slow tolls, a death. 1 long, 2 short. Meeting at the chapel, rapid ringing, fire. A rising pattern, raiders or worse. Meaning, the wrong signal at the wrong time could lead to chaos. So the system had to be simple, but universal. And it wasn't just about survival, it was about order. Bells also acted as timekeepers in a world without clocks. Canonical hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, and so on, were marked with chimes. Even peasants who couldn't read or write could structure their day by listening. When to milk the goats, when to pray, when to come in from the fields. The bells carved time out of chaos. But the bells weren't always fair. In some places, only the church could ring them. In others, the local lord controlled the signal, using it to enforce labour or summon peasants to duty. There are records of bells being used to mobilise levies, signalling that the able-bodied men had to gather, weapons in hand because the border had been breached. Not every ring meant death, but every ring meant something you couldn't ignore. And here's your fringe fact for today. In a few towns, the bells themselves were believed to have magical power. During plagues, people rang them constantly, believing the vibrations could drive away disease or evil spirits. Some bells were blessed or named. Others were forged with inscriptions meant to ward off curses. Dramatic? Yes, but maybe not entirely wrong. You pass a boy playing with a tiny wooden replica of the bell tower. He's mimicking the tolls with a stick, practicing rhythms. His grandmother calls out, correcting him. She scolds! He laughs, and then they start again. It's strange, almost sweet. This isn't just alarm or ritual, it's language passed on like lullabies. Of course, there's scholarly debate around just how standardized these codes really were. Some argue that the meanings change constantly, that they were little more than guesswork tied to tradition. Others point to how consistently bells appear in records of crises, fires, battles, storms. When everything else failed, the bell still rang, loud, clear, and impossible to ignore. As evening falls, the mist finally lifts, revealing a sky streaked with gold and smoke. The belfry stands quiet now, silhouetted against the treetops. You realise how comforting that silence is. No fire, no plague, no invaders, no call to arms, just peace. For now. You head back to the barn, grateful for the warning that delayed the ploughing. If you'd been out in the fields earlier, your soaked boots might have been something worse. People drown in marshes here. It happens fast and without a sound. But the bell had told them, not today. Wait. And maybe that's the lesson tonight. In a world without text messages or sirens, a single bell toll could mean the difference between safety and disaster. All you had to do was listen and remember which pattern might just save your life. You leave the village with the bell tower behind you, heading east along a road that's more mud than path. The kind of road where each step tries to suck your boots off, and you wonder whether medieval people ever really got used to this, or if they just accepted that life was one long battle with the terrain. A heavy mist still clings to the fields, curling around tree trunks like old ghosts, and everything is wet. Not rain wet, just soaked by time. Even your bones feel damp. After a few miles, you come across a pair of travellers huddled under a skeletal-looking tree. One of them is rubbing something on his feet, something thick, pale, and glistening in the early light. You almost keep walking, but curiosity wins. You ask him what it is, and he holds up a clay pot with a smirk. "Goose fat," he says. You raise an eyebrow. "Goose fat? Works better than prayer," he adds, and honestly, that tracks. In the medieval world, goose fat was the original all-purpose travel hack. You sit beside them and ask for the story. Turns out this isn't some random superstition. It's a survival tactic passed down by soldiers, hunters, and desperate winter travellers. First off, it's insulating. When rubbed on the skin, goose fat created a natural barrier against wind and moisture. People slathered it on their feet before slipping into worn leather boots, on their hands before a trek, and even across their chest under rough wool to keep warm. It was the medieval version of a thermal layer, oily, slippery, and surprisingly effective. You glance at your own cracked hands and half-frozen toes and begin to wonder why this isn't still a thing. It might smell like yesterday's dinner, but if it meant not losing a toe to frostbite, who cares? There's more. According to the older traveller, missing 2 teeth but full of stories, goose fat was sometimes mixed with herbs to create salves for everything from sore joints to chest congestion. Bay leaves for circulation, thyme for warmth, nettle for nerve pain. The mixture would be warmed by the fire, then rubbed in with rough hands until the skin absorbed every last bit of grease. Travellers swore by it. Some even believed it warded off illness, though in fairness, everything back then was believed to ward off illness. And the best part? It was cheap, at least for those who had access to geese. You didn't need a fancy apothecary or nobleman's purse. If you were clever enough to raise and pluck your own, you had an all-weather, all-purpose potion in your backyard. Now for the quirky bit. Goose fat wasn't just for warmth, it was also used for stealth. In some regions, especially among border raiders or smugglers, people would coat the soles of their boots in it, not just to waterproof them, but to reduce the noise of their steps. A well-greased boot squeaked less, slid more, and left softer footprints. Basically, it turned you into a medieval ninja with oily feet. You laugh at the thought, and the younger traveller grins. "We've slipped past more than one watch that way," he says. "Apparently stealth has a trade-off, traction. Of course, some of this is up for debate. Not every historian agrees goose fat was this popular. Some claim the records are too sparse or that it was more regional than widespread. Others argue it was a luxury reserved for the wealthy or those close to poultry. But oral tradition paints a different picture. The fact that these 2 ragged men on the side of a forgotten road both carry goose fat like it's gold, that tells you everything you need to know. You ask if it's ever been used for, say, cooking instead, and the older man snorts. He points at his hands. "You can always catch another rabbit." Fair point. You sit for a while longer, watching as they finish their morning ritual. One pulls on patched-up boots with a practiced tug, sealing in the layer of fat. The other rubs some on a fresh scrape across his shin. They offer you a bit from the jar, and you hesitate for only a second before accepting. It's cold and greasy and clings to your fingers like clingy oatmeal. You rub it into your cracked knuckles and feel for the first time in days some real relief. There's something almost intimate about it. This act of greasing up for the road. Not glamorous, not noble, but real. Medieval survival wasn't always about battlefields or grand quests. More often it came down to figuring out how to not freeze to death between villages. You assume he's joking, but also, maybe not. You tuck the last smear of fat into a scrap of cloth and slip it into your pack, just in case. You walk on with warmer hands, softer steps, and one more secret tucked into your journey. Sometimes the thing that keeps you alive isn't steel or fire, it's goose fat. And yes, it smells weird. But then again, so does everything out here. You're walking with a new swagger now, well, a subtle one. More like a mildly confident limp, really. Your boots are greased, your hands feel less like bark, and the morning air, though still biting, doesn't feel like it's trying to kill you anymore. A win. You're headed downhill into a slightly larger village than the last few. Wooden signs hanging over doors, a chapel with stained glass so faded it looks like old bruises, and a cluster of low stone houses built tightly together, their chimneys belching blue smoke into the crisp air. You follow your nose toward the centre of the settlement, hoping for something warm and edible. Instead, you find something a little more social, A communal meal. About 20 people sit cross-legged around a long wooden table set in the open square, passing around bowls of stew and hunks of coarse bread. You pause at the edge of the scene, unsure of the etiquette. Then a woman, middle-aged, tough hands, sharper eyes, waves you over and holds out a bowl. You're in. But here's where things get interesting. No one has their own plate or utensils. There's one long loaf of bread being torn and passed. 2 large wooden bowls are being shared between groups. And as you reach for a bite, you notice something else. People are watching, closely, not rudely, but carefully. Measuring. It hits you. They're watching how you eat. In the medieval world, communal eating wasn't just about food. It was a full-blown trust exercise. Every bite was a test of honesty, health, and even loyalty. Forks? Not a thing yet. Spoons were common but often shared. Knives were personal, you brought your own. But more importantly, you ate in public view. And if you tried anything shady, like slipping something into someone's portion, you'd be noticed fast. You sit cautiously and watch how it works. One man tears bread and dips it into the bowl. He takes a bite, then passes the bread to the woman next to him. She doesn't hesitate. No one double dips, no one hoards. Everything's about rhythm and fairness. And here's the survival secret buried in this seemingly chaotic picnic. Communal eating made it much harder to poison someone. Especially in small villages or noble courts, food was often served from shared bowls, and portions were not pre-assigned. You didn't know exactly what bite you, or someone else, would get. This made slipping poison into a specific dish a risky business. If you got caught trying, well, hope you enjoy public execution, but beyond that, communal meals acted as a kind of primitive quality control system. If someone's stew smelled off, or if a piece of meat looked grey, others would notice and say something. Remember, food poisoning wasn't just uncomfortable in the Middle Ages, it could be deadly. So communities developed an unspoken, collectively enforced etiquette to keep things safe. The woman next to you nudges the bowl your way. You dip your bread and chew slowly. The stew is hot, hearty, and suspiciously good. Potatoes, root vegetables, maybe a hint of wild garlic. You nod your thanks. She smiles but keeps her eyes on you, just making sure you're not sketchy. Fair. There's another layer to all this, though. The shared table as a legal and social bond. In many medieval traditions, eating together meant forming trust, sometimes even formal alliances. There are records of peace treaties being sealed with meals because sharing food symbolized shared fates. You don't poison someone you just broke bread with, at least not if you want to be invited back. This is why nobles had food tasters, why kings dined in public, why monks all ate in stunned silence but under watchful eyes. Because what you ate and how you ate it was a matter of life and death. Now for your fringe fact. Some wealthy households developed elaborate food rituals specifically to prevent poisoning. Think carved trenchers, bread plates to absorb toxins, silver spoons, silver they believed would tarnish in the presence of poison, and perhaps the oddest one, carrying your own salt. Not for seasoning, but because communal salt bowls could be tampered with. If you brought your own, you could trust it. Maybe. Back at your table, you notice the kids eating last, after the elders, after the visitors, not out of disrespect, but because the older folks want to ensure the food is safe before handing it off to the most vulnerable. It's not superstition, it's the result of centuries of hard-earned caution. There's scholarly debate over just how common poisoning really was in the Middle Ages. Some argue it's overblown, mostly legend and paranoia. Others point to the endless court scandals, mysterious deaths, and obsession with antidotes as proof that it happened more than people want to admit. But regardless of frequency, the fear of it shaped behaviour, and that fear became etiquette, and etiquette eventually became survival. As the meal winds down, someone pulls out a skin of cider and passes it around. You hesitate for just a second. The woman notices and chuckles. "No one's poisoning cider," she says, comforting, in a very specific medieval sort of way. You drink. It's tart and sharp and exactly what your throat needed. The bowl returns, now scraped nearly clean, and people begin to rise, stretching and murmuring to one another in the fading light. One man, a smith by the look of his hands, offers you a place to sleep in his workshop. You accept, grateful and full. As you follow him, you glance back at the sebble, just scraps and crumbs now, but what lingers is the memory of 20 eyes on you as you reached for your first bite. Not hostile, just careful, because in a world where trust was scarce and danger could hide in a spoonful of stew, The dinner table was the first line of defence. You wake to the rhythmic clank of metal against metal. The blacksmith's workshop is already alive with noise and heat, even though the sun's barely crept above the thatched rooftops. You slept curled in a corner, wedged between a rack of horseshoes and a suspiciously stained apron, and now your back is filing a formal complaint. But the warmth from the forge was real, and that's not nothing in a world where stone floors can suck the life out of your bones overnight. The smith nods at you without turning from his anvil. He's shaping something heavy and curved, maybe a scythe blade, maybe an oversized spoon. Hard to tell, but it's the wall behind him that catches your eye. There's a strange little sketch drawn in charcoal, a square with a tiny sun in the corner and an arrow pointing to one side. You step closer. He sees your interest. You blink. Wall. For winter, he explains. Ah, this is the kind of medieval wisdom that doesn't make it into history books or fantasy novels, but it kept more people alive than all the knights combined. Because out here, where winters bite hard and fuel is limited, sunlight was one of the best survival tools around. You step outside the shop and look around with fresh eyes. Now you see it. Many of the houses are built with one long wall facing the rising sun, and more importantly the southern sun. It's not accidental, it's deliberate, and it's brilliant. In the northern hemisphere, a south-facing wall gets the most consistent sunlight throughout the day. In summer that's nice. In winter it's critical. A well-placed wall can soak in heat during the day and radiate it inward at night. Medieval builders didn't need a science degree to figure this out. They just watched the seasons. They paid attention to which wall stayed warmer, where frost lingered, and where moss refused to grow. Survival meant observation. You pass a house where laundry is hanging from pegs driven into the southern-facing wall, already half dry while the northern side of the building still glistens with frost. A woman catches you staring and waves her hand. That side's dead till spring, she says, pointing to the shady north. At this side, you find a sunny spot and try it. It works. The stone holds heat like a bread oven. You stretch your legs and feel the difference almost immediately. Here's where it gets even more clever. Many medieval homes were designed so their south-facing walls could double as solar kitchens or drying areas. Herbs hung from the eaves. Bread rose faster near those walls. In lean times, when firewood was scarce or entirely gone, people relied on these pockets of stored heat to keep food edible and bodies alive. Some homes went a step further. Lean-to additions were built along the south side, using the main wall as both a heat source and a windbreak. In wealthier homes, glass windows, rare and costly, were installed on the sunward side to trap heat like a primitive greenhouse. And in monasteries, south-facing cloisters were ideal for reading, writing, and not freezing while doing so. You pass a cottage with a pig lounging on a stone platform pressed against the sun-facing side of the home. It's not cute, it's strategic. Livestock knew the best spots instinctively, Toru, and people followed suit. Shared warmth wasn't sentimental, it was efficient. Of course, there's a quirk to this trick. In regions with steep hills or dense forests, finding true southern exposure could be tricky. That's where local superstition met practical geometry. People sometimes planted sun sticks, small poles used to track where the longest shadows fell during the solstice. Not exactly Stonehenge-level precision, but enough to orient a building. Imagine building your house not by a compass, but by the movement of shade on a chicken coop. Historians still debate just how widespread this sun-facing wisdom really was. Some argue it was regional, common in the Alps, the British Isles, or colder climates, but not universal. Others say it's been underreported because it was never formally written down. Why record what everyone already knows? And that's the thing. This knowledge didn't come from scholars. It came from generations of people who paid attention, who learned that if you fell asleep on the wrong side of the barn, you woke up with your nose frozen shut. Who figured out, one frostbitten morning at a time, that the sun could save your life if you let it in. You stroll back to the blacksmith's shop as the morning warms. He's still at work, the wall behind him soaking in light like a loyal companion. You nod toward it. Clever setup, you say. He grunts. My grandfather built it. You're not sure what that means, but you like the sound of it. Later that day, as you set off again, you find yourself eyeing every building you pass. South wall, good. North side mossy, also good. That's how you know they're doing it right. The sun is your quietest, steadiest ally. No horses, no swords, no coin purse needed. Just a wall facing the right way, and enough sense to sit beside it. So here's your secret for the road. Build toward the sun, lean into the light, and remember that even in the darkest times, warmth might come from something as simple as the right wall. You're starting to notice something odd as you travel deeper into the heartland, something no one warned you about. It isn't the hunger or the cold, it's not the relentless walking or the smell, which, to be fair, has levelled up from earthy to barnyard bouquet. It's this: no one is bathing. Or if they are, they're doing it so infrequently and so secretly that you're starting to wonder if you're the weird one for missing soap. At first, you thought maybe you just hadn't stumbled across a bathhouse yet. But after the third village, and a particularly memorable encounter with a shepherd whose scent could fell a wild boar, you're starting to get the picture. This isn't laziness, it's survival strategy. In the medieval world, staying dirty could actually help keep you alive. You reach a small hamlet nestled near a stream. A boy is scooping water into a barrel while a woman scrubs clothes on a flat stone nearby. You ask her if the village has a bathhouse. She laughs, actually laughs, and shakes her head. You want to catch your death. Go soak your bones in December, she says, wringing out a tunic. Lost his lungs? She means he died, from pneumonia, which, to be fair, you might catch too if you stripped down and sat in a drafty room full of lukewarm water and no towels. The reality is that bathing in the Middle Ages was complicated. Early on, especially in Roman-influenced areas, public bathhouses were common. Cleanliness was even associated with piety and health. Monasteries had scheduled bathing days, and wealthier folks sometimes had private tubs. But by the high medieval period, that shifted. Several things happened. First, people started associating water with disease, especially during plagues. Dirty water could kill you, and warm, steamy bathhouses, perfect breeding grounds for illness, or so people believed. Germ theory wasn't a thing yet, but intuition was. If more people got sick after bathing, then maybe it was the bath's fault. Logical in a very unscientific sort of way. Then there was the moral panic. Bathhouses, once places of hygiene and community, gradually became synonymous with sin and scandal. In many towns they turned into thinly veiled brothels, leading religious leaders to condemn them outright. In some regions, bathhouses were shut down entirely, not because of hygiene concerns, but because people were having too much fun. You wander into the village alehouse to warm your hands. Inside, it's smoky, crowded, and full of people who clearly haven't washed in days. Weeks, maybe. And yet, no one seems especially ill. You start to realise there's a pattern here. Grime was armour. When you lived elbow to elbow with livestock, dirt and disease, your skin, covered in its own natural oils and layers of dried sweat, acted like a weird organic barrier. Frequent washing, especially with harsh soap, could leave your skin vulnerable to infection. Cracked hands, exposed wounds, and wet hair in cold weather were all invitations to the Grim Reaper. So instead of bathing, people wiped down with cloths, rubbed themselves with vinegar, or smoked their clothes over fires to kill lice. In some cases, they dust themselves with dried herbs or ashes to absorb sweat and deter fleas. Not pleasant, but effective. Ish. And here's the weirdest part. Some physicians actually recommended staying dirty during the outbreaks. One 14th century doctor wrote that opening your pores with hot water was a surefire way to let in the bad air that carried disease. Better to stay sealed up tight in your natural crust. Delicious. Of course, not everyone agreed. Wealthy nobles still bathed occasionally, usually with scented oils, rosewater or milk, because apparently rubbing yourself with breakfast was peak luxury. And in certain cities like Paris or Florence, public bathhouses limped on into the late medieval period, offering hot baths, massages, and occasionally a little extra, if you get what I'm saying. Scholars argue over how dirty people really were. Some say the filthy medieval stereotype is exaggerated, pointing to records of linen washing, beard grooming, and perfumed sachets. Others say, sure, maybe your shirt got cleaned now and then, but your actual body? Not so much. And most agree that wintertime bathing was especially rare. You didn't tempt fate by catching a chill. Back at the alehouse, a woman pulls her toddler away from a puddle near the hearth and says something in a hushed tone. Another layer of the fear. Some believe that rivers and streams could be haunted, not just by disease but by creatures, wights, nixies, unseen hands that dragged bathers under. It wasn't just the cold that kept people away, it was the unknown. You start to think about your own hygiene. You haven't bathed in a while. You don't smell great. You feel the grime building up in the creases of your elbows, behind your ears. But weirdly, your skin isn't raw. and your hands haven't cracked since that one cold night weeks ago. Maybe there's something to this filth. One traveller tells you he wears the same tunic for a month straight, only turning it inside out halfway through. Keeps the fleas confused, he says with a wink. Probably not scientific, but then again, you're still alive, and so is he. As night falls and the alehouse fills with the scent of old wool, smoke and sour beer, you find yourself leaning into it. You wrap your cloak tighter, scratch your beard and embrace the funk. You realise that in the Middle Ages, clean didn't always mean safe, and dirty didn't always mean doomed. Sometimes survival meant skipping the bath and trusting your crust. You're woken in the middle of the night by a sound that doesn't belong, sharp, distant and repeated. A rhythmic clang, fast and insistent, echoing through the cold darkness. It's not the bell tower this time. This is more frantic. A metal-on-metal clatter that cuts through the sleeping village like a blade. You stumble out of the hayloft, boots half-laced, cloak dragging men, and follow the noise toward the centre of town. You're not the only one. Faces peek from shuttered windows. A few villagers rush into the square half-dressed, eyes wide. The sound is coming from the chapel, a young boy pounding on the iron bell with a hammer, not using the rope. That's not standard. You spin around and see it. A tongue of flame licking up from the edge of the village, near the woodshed and stable. In the dry chill of early winter, fire moves like it has a vendetta. People bolt into action, grabbing buckets, cloaks, anything they can find. But what's remarkable isn't the chaos, it's how coordinated it all is. No screaming, no confusion, everyone seems to know exactly what to do. Welcome to the Village Bell Code, Fire Edition. Last time you learned how bells communicated warnings, meetings, or death. But tonight, you see them in action as a life-saving system designed for speed and precision. That bell is not just ringing randomly, it's using a very specific pattern. Short, sharp strikes in a rapid sequence. You hear it and your body moves before your brain finishes the sentence. You grab a water bucket from outside the smith's and join the chain forming between the well and the blaze. It's surprisingly smooth. One person dips, another runs, another throws. A human conveyor belt fueled by fear and routine. Because here's the key. This has happened before. Enough times that the response is drilled into memory like a reflex. And the bell? It's not just a warning, it's a coordinator. It tells people where to go, when to switch, even which side of the fire to focus on. And everyone, from the shoemaker's apprentice to the toothless old woman in a bonnet, knows the code. Back by the chapel, the young boy finally stops ringing and sits, panting, as the bell sways above him. He's no hero. He's just doing what he's been trained to do since he could stand. Because in this village, everyone is part of the fire brigade, whether they like it or not. It takes 2 hours, a dozen buckets, and a few lucky gusts of wind, but the fire's finally under control. 2 sheds are gone, a wagon scorched but no homes caught. You sit on a cold stone, breath visible in the moonlight, watching as neighbours hug, nod, grunt. They've survived another one. The woman who housed you last night sits beside you and offers a chunk of dried apple. Happens every winter, she says. Chimneys clog, sparks fly. And that's the magic, isn't it? The bell isn't just a noisemaker. It's a medieval emergency broadcast system built not from wires or satellites, but from rhythm, community and generational memory. There's a fringe bit of lore she mentions too. Some villagers believed the bell itself had the power to repel fire. Blessed by priests, inscribed with Latin phrases, or forged with sacred metals, the bell wasn't just an alarm, it was a protector. In some towns, bells were rung after a fire had been put out, as a kind of spiritual sealing of the land, to warn off further destruction, or bad luck, or whatever it was people believed hid in the soot. You hear stories that in some places, fires were believed to be caused by angry spirits, forest demons, cursed ancestors, witches, and the bell sound? That was the human answer. Noise to scare away the unseen. Science or not, it worked. Historians debate just how organised medieval fire responses really were. Some claim that in big cities there were actual night watchers tasked with ringing bells and keeping fires in check. Others say it was more informal, just villagers reacting to what they saw or smelled. But out here, in the smaller settlements, the bell system makes perfect sense. No one can afford to sleep through a fire, and you can't shout across a valley, so you train your ears. As dawn creeps in, the villagers begin the slow cleanup. Soot-smudged faces, splintered timbers, and more than a few exhausted sighs. But there's no panic, no breakdown, just movement. People sweep Hall Hammer, and behind it all the bell looms, quiet now, but ready. You help stack what's left of the burned shed into a neat pile, and notice the blacksmith nearby checking the bell's frame, making sure it's solid. He catches your eye and shrugs. "It's not fancy," he says. "That's the point, isn't it?" You walk away later that morning, back aching and hands raw, but feeling strangely reassured. You're beginning to understand that in this world, survival wasn't about the strength of your sword or the sharpness of your wit. It was about community, shared knowledge, and being able to recognise exactly what 5 quick chimes meant at 2 in the morning. So here's your lesson from the ashes. When everything's flammable, you don't wait for smoke, you listen for the bell, and when it rings, you run. You're passing through a narrow forest trail now, where the trees lean in like they're trying to listen to your thoughts. The path has mostly turned to packed snow and frozen mud, and every breath you take cuts like a blade. You've wrapped your cloak tighter, tied rags around your boots, and you're trying not to think about your fingers. They've gone numb, which is either normal or incredibly bad. Hard to tell at this point. Then, through the trees, you spot something strange. A figure moving, but not like a traveller. Their steps are deliberate, slow, almost mechanical. As you get closer, the silhouette takes shape. A man wearing something that shouldn't be armour, but kind of looks like it. You squint. It's not metal, not shiny, not clinking. It's brownish, patchy, weirdly bulky around the shoulders. And then it hits you. Boiled leather. You catch up to him. He's carrying a poleaxe and seems surprised to see another traveller out here. He gives you a nod. You tell him he looks like he's wearing a roasted animal. He grins. Close. Cowhide. Turns out you've just met someone wearing the medieval equivalent of a budget bulletproof vest. Because in a world where iron and steel were expensive and hard to get, especially for your average villager or mercenary, people turned to what they had. Leather. Lots of it. The process was simple in theory, though not easy in practice. Fresh, thick cowhide was cut to shape and then boiled in water or wax, depending on your local recipe. The boiling hardened the leather, making it stiff, almost shell-like. Once cooled, it could be formed into chest plates, shoulder guards, helmets, even shields. It wouldn't stop a longbow, but it could take a glancing sword blow, or a cudgel to the ribs, and turn a fatal injury into a survivable bruise. The man lets you touch the armour. It's hard but flexible, cracked at the edges, clearly worn through years of use. "Used to belong to my brother," he says. He doesn't offer details, and you don't ask. Boiled leather, or cuir was used for everything from armour to sheaths to reinforced boots. Knights sneered at it, of course. Real men wore chainmail, plate gleaming steel forged by some one-eyed smith with a tragic past. But most people, they weren't knights, they were foot soldiers, guards, caravan escorts, you basically. And they needed something affordable that didn't weigh as much as a donkey. There are debates among historians about just how effective boiled leather was. Some claim it was purely decorative by the late Middle Ages, worn more for intimidation than actual protection. Others point to preserved pieces found in peat bogs and tombs, showing clear signs of battle damage and repair. What's undeniable is this: people wore it, and they trusted it. Your new companion tells you that some soldiers painted or etched symbols into the leather, believing it offered not just physical protection, but spiritual too. He lifts his arm to show a crude sigil on the shoulder, a sunburst with a line through it. "Keeps blades from biting," he says, not entirely joking. And then there's the smell. Oh boy. Wet, waxed leather mixed with body heat, and weeks of road travel smells like a dead cow that's been hitting the gym. The guy doesn't seem to notice. You try to breathe through your mouth. As you walk together, he tells you how in lean times people would cut up old harnesses or saddles, boil them down, and stitch together makeshift armour. There's a kind of rough poetry to that. You learn that in some regions, boiled leather armour was combined with bits of metal, nail heads, small plates, even broken knives sewn into the lining to create what was basically medieval DIY body armour. One wrong move and you'd stab yourself just by turning too fast, but hey, better than dying with a clean tunic. The guy pulls out a small round object from his pack, a boiled leather cap, reinforced with stitched-in ribs of deer antler. "Wore it through 2 winters, he says. "Took an axe to the head once, helmet broke." You nod, impressed, and maybe slightly horrified. Of course, armour like this had its limits. Against arrows, especially from powerful longbows or crossbows, it was more of a suggestion than a solution. But for close combat or fending off an angry traveller with a rusted blade, boiled leather was a game changer. It let the poor protect themselves. It gave outlaws a chance. It bought time. There's a story he tells as you approach a fork in the trail. A young squire, wearing nothing but boiled leather and courage, standing against a bandit lord's elite. Everyone thought he'd die in seconds. He lasted 6 minutes, killed 2, gave his knight time to escape. The armour was returned to his family, repaired and worn again, passed down like a grim heirloom. That's the thing about this kind of gear. It wasn't flashy, but it was personal. It bore the scars of its wearers. You could tell a man's story by the scratches on his chest piece or the stitched patch where an arrow once landed. It was armour made not for display, but for living and sometimes dying in. The man nods goodbye at the fork and takes the road west. You keep walking, but your mind lingers on the texture of his armour, the creak of it as he moved, and the quiet pride in his voice. You start to think maybe you don't need a gleaming sword or a silver helm. Maybe all you really need is a hide, a pot of boiling water, and the will to keep walking. So here's your takeaway. Real protection isn't always forged. It's boiled, stitched, patched, and passed down. And yeah, it smells terrible. You're following a footpath that weaves along a ridge, flanked by mossy stones and bare, wind-battered trees. The cold gnaws at your fingers again, and you're hungry again, always hungry. Your last real meal was a bowl of mystery stew 2 villages ago, and since then it's been apples with worms or worms without apples. You're keeping an eye out for something edible, but as usual, you have no idea what's safe to touch, let alone eat, which is why you're glad to spot a woman crouched near a clearing, poking carefully at a cluster of mushrooms with a stick. She's muttering to herself and wearing a pouch so full of herbs it's basically a portable hedge. You approach slowly, and when she doesn't immediately hiss at you or vanish into a tree, you take it as a good sign. You ask, pointing at the mushrooms. Death, if you don't know the difference, she says without looking up. Right. Turns out one of the most essential survival tools in the Middle Ages was folklore, especially when it came to food. The woman explains it while she gently slices a few small brown-capped mushrooms and drops them into her basket. We don't have books out here, she says. She recites one. Red on top, you'd better stop. White and wide, best run and hide. If it glows or smells too sweet, don't put it anywhere near your teeth. You repeat it, mostly to lock it into your brain before the hunger makes you do something foolish. That rhyme, or some version of it, existed across countless villages, passed from grandmother to grandchild, keeping people alive one cryptic phrase at a time, because back then there was no central manual on what to eat. Nature didn't come with labels. You learned by watching others, or, tragically often, by watching what killed them. The woman holds up a cluster of bright red berries. These'll bind your guts so tight you'll beg for death, she says casually, then tosses them into the woods. You ask how anyone figured that out. She shrugs. That's the constant tone of survival out here. Someone had to die for the rest of us to learn. You start walking with her, eyes scanning the underbrush. She points out nettles, good for soup, dock leaves, good for stings, a weird-looking root that looks like a demon's toe. Safe if it's white inside, poison if yellow, don't guess. You realise just how thin the line is between nourishment and funeral. There are berries that look just like the kind you buy at the market, but one bite and you're done. Mushrooms that smell amazing but shut down your liver in an hour. Even harmless-looking plants like foxglove, which still grow in pretty clusters outside cottages, can stop your heart with a nibble. So how did medieval people navigate this botanical minefield? Memory, myth, and meticulous observation. They remembered what grew where and when. They noticed that deer wouldn't eat a certain leaf, or that goats puked after grazing a certain patch. They passed down strange stories, like the tale of the witch's parsley that caused pregnant women to miscarry. Whether true or not, those stories stuck, and that meant people avoided dangerous plants even if they didn't fully understand why. And sometimes the warning signs were more supernatural than scientific. Plants growing in graveyards? Avoid. Mushrooms in perfect circles? Definitely fairy territory. A tree struck by lightning? Cursed. Sure, it sounds like superstition, but in many cases, it worked. Plants in damp, overgrown or rotten places were more likely to carry toxins or parasites. So whether they called it magic or just bad luck, the result was the same: caution. The woman shows you a little cloth book, hand-stitched, barely legible. Inside are pressed leaves, crude drawings and little notes. My mother's, she says. You're impressed. It's basically a medieval field guide minus the Latin, and it hits you. This is what science looked like before it wore a lab coat. Trial and error, memory and myth, knowledge earned in blood. There's a darker story she tells too, about a village that once mistook a harmless-looking root for wild carrot. A whole family gone. And after that, no one touched that patch of earth again. They even built a shrine on it just to be safe. Historians today still puzzle over how accurate these oral traditions were. Some scoff at the idea of reliable plant lore without written sources. Others point out that indigenous and rural communities have survived for centuries on exactly this kind of passed-down knowledge, even if they called it magic instead of botany. And let's be honest, if it keeps you alive, does it really matter what you call it? By the time the sun starts to dip, you've filled your own pouch with a few edible greens, a couple mushrooms she says won't kill you, and one suspicious root you'll definitely never touch. The woman wishes you luck and vanishes down a side path, humming a tune that sounds suspiciously like another warning disguised as a lullaby. As you make camp near a stone wall, you cook what little you've gathered over a tiny fire and chew slowly, carefully, waiting for your stomach to either settle or rebel. So far, so good. The stars come out, an owl calls, and somewhere in the back of your mind a new rhyme forms. If you're not sure, don't chew. If it smells wrong, it is. If it grows where bones lie, let it be. Not bad. So here's your survival secret tonight. Folklore might sound foolish, but it kept more peasants alive than all the knights and priests combined. Trust the rhymes, fear the berries, and maybe, just maybe, don't eat the root that looks like a demon's toe. You're getting used to the smell of damp wool and wood smoke by now. It's practically part of your skin. The frost hasn't let up and the wind has found a special way to sneak under your cloak, right at the base of your neck. Like it knows exactly how to make you regret every life choice that led you here. You've taken to walking with your head slightly down, hands pulled inside your sleeves just trying to keep warm, and that's when you notice it. Everyone around here wears a hood, not just a casual scarf or a cap. A full-on, pull-it-down, deep-scooped medieval hood, sewn onto a cloak or worn over the shoulders like a cowl. Kids, elders, farmers hauling hay. Even the dogs seem jealous. You finally ask a man leading a donkey why the obsession. "Wind'll steal your ears," he grunts. "Fair." But as you keep moving through this cluster of villages, you begin to realise the medieval hood was doing a lot more than just blocking the breeze. It was, quite literally, an all-purpose survival tool. First, the obvious, weather. Hoods were the original insulation, especially for people who didn't have access to heavy cloaks or animal furs. Made from wool, linen, or layered scraps, a well-fitted hood could trap warmth around your head and neck, where heat loss was worst. And unlike modern hats, it didn't blow off in the wind or soak through as easily. Plus, you could pull it low over your face in the rain, over your eyes in the sun, or stuff straw inside it for extra warmth in winter. Some folks even slept in them, bundled like human turnips. But beyond comfort, there's something tactical about it. You start to notice how people keep their faces partially hidden. A shadow here, a twist of fabric there. In a world where there are no photo IDs and most people are known only by vague reputation and the colour of their donkey, a hood offers anonymity. You could disappear into one village, throw the hood up and become a total stranger in the next. Thieves used them, so did messengers. Even travelling monks, whose hoods became so iconic that certain orders were identified by the size or shape of their cowl. Hooded figures moved in silence, unnoticed, until they wanted to be noticed. You walk past a roadside shrine where someone's carved a small stone relief of a hooded figure with a walking stick. It's not labelled, but it doesn't have to be. Travellers, pilgrims, exiles, the hood was their badge. There's a fringe fact you hear at a tavern, over a bowl of lukewarm pea porridge. A toothless man tells you that during certain feasts, villagers would wear their hoods backward to ward off evil spirits. Another swears that witches wore 2 layers of hoods to confuse demons. Superstition? Sure. But when your world is full of curses, frostbite and bandits layering your wool, funny is a small price to pay for peace of mind. Historically, hoods evolved with class, too. The poor wore functional hoods, plain patched, often part of their only garment. Nobles and merchants rocked more elaborate versions, trimmed in fur with liripipes, the long pointy tails, for extra flair. It became a fashion statement, yes, but the practical roots never went away. Even royalty got cold ears. Some records describe armoured hoods, leather-lined coifs or mail pieces hidden under fabric, a way to keep your head protected without advertising you were ready for a fight. because in places where you didn't want to scare people or attract attention, stealth armour made a lot of sense. There's debate among historians over whether the hood originated from necessity or as a religious symbol. After all, monks wore them long before peasants made them popular. But whatever their origin, by the high medieval period the hood was everywhere. Ubiquitous, unquestioned, as vital as shoes or belts. You visit a home where the father shows you a 3-in-1 hood, part head covering, part neck warmer, part built-in scarf. "My mother made it," he says proudly. You look around the room and see 4 identical hoods hanging by the fire. One has clearly been patched with more thread than wool. Another has tiny carved wooden beads sewn into the edge. They're not just tools, they are personal. And here's something you never thought about. Hoods protect more than scare. They protect hearing. In icy wind or heavy rain, your ears become useless. But a lined hood muffles the storm, keeping your senses sharper. When you're walking alone in the woods, maybe being hunted by wolves or worse, that might be the only thing between you and an ambush. You try wearing one yourself, a gift from a shepherd whose sheep you helped nudge back into the pen earlier that day. It's itchy and smells faintly like wet hay, but you pull it up anyway. Suddenly the world narrows. Your breath warms your face, the wind is gentler, and most of all you feel invisible, which out here is kind of magical. By the time night falls, you've noticed that people greet you differently now, less cautious. One man even offers you a piece of bread without a word. You realise your hood isn't just warmth or camouflage, it marks you as a traveller, a known unknown, someone with stories but no roots. That's powerful in a world where everything and everyone is sorted by the land and name. So here's your survival tip for tonight. The medieval hood isn't just a fashion choice, it's armour, shelter and social camouflage wrapped into one. Put it on right and you stay warm. Pull it low and you go unseen. Keep it patched and you might just make it through winter without losing your ears or your identity. You finally make it to a town with actual walls, not the kind made of logs and hopeful thinking, but real stone stacked thick and grey, with guards at the gate who eye you like you might sneeze gold. You give them your best harmless traveller look, which mostly involves shrugging a lot and not making sudden movements. After a minute of grumbling, they wave you through. Inside, it's bigger than anywhere you've been so far. Streets, markets, smoke from a dozen chimneys, the clang of metal from a smithy, a narrow alley full of people shouting about fish. But what draws your attention isn't the market stalls or the noise. It's the inn tucked between 2 crooked buildings like it grew there by accident. A faded wooden sign swings above the door. The Blue Boar. You don't care if it's blue, green, or imaginary. All that matters is there's firelight flickering behind those windows and the smell of hot food leaking into the street. You duck inside and are instantly hit by the warmth and weight of bodies. The inn is packed, cloaks drip by the fire. A bard sings something wildly off-key in the corner, but your focus narrows to a single miracle. A bed, or rather half a bed, maybe a third, a sliver of one. The innkeeper spots you eyeing it and raises a brow. 6 pence gets you a space, he says. You fish out a coin, and before he even takes it, someone else drops their sack on the mattress. Too late, the innkeeper says. You pick the loft. Welcome to one of the weirder, grittier realities of medieval life. Communal sleeping. Out here, privacy is luxury. And not just because people are poor, but because space is limited and warmth is priceless. You climb the narrow ladder into the upper floor and find 4 other travellers already laid out on thin straw pallets. Boots still on. Cloaks wrapped around them. One makes room for you with a grunt. You take it as a heartfelt invitation. You lay down cautiously. The straw smells like old oats and something faintly rodenty, but it's warm and you're exhausted, so you pull your hood low and try to settle in. Now you'd think this would be the point where everyone goes quiet and drifts off peacefully. Not even close. One guy is muttering a prayer under his breath. Another is humming. A third keeps fidgeting, adjusting, shifting, elbowing the wall like he's fighting ghosts. And someone is already snoring loudly and unapologetically. You stare at the rafters and accept that sleep is going to be a group project. This, you realise, is normal. In the medieval world, especially in towns or during travel, sharing a bed or sleeping space with strangers was completely expected. Inns rarely had private rooms unless you were rich enough to demand one. Most people shared pallets, mattresses, or just the floor, sometimes 2 to a bed, sometimes 5, sometimes more. They didn't even always sleep in the same direction. Head to foot was common, not just for space, but to avoid awkward eye contact at midnight. There's a soft creak and someone beside you pulls the blanket up to their chin. You realise they're watching you, just like you're watching them. Mutual suspicion is part of the deal. After all, bed sharing in the Middle Ages wasn't just cosy, it was risky. You didn't know who might steal your boots while you slept, or your coin pouch, or your life in some unfortunate cases. But here's the kicker. Sometimes sharing a bed was seen as safe, safer than sleeping alone, especially on the road. Thieves were less likely to attack a group, and warmth was a serious matter. Hypothermia could strike even indoors, especially with damp walls and frozen windows, so sleeping close to someone, anyone, could mean survival. You shift onto your side, careful not to elbow your neighbour. "No," you whisper. He chuckles. "Good, last guy rolled off the loft." You can't tell if that's a joke, but you laugh anyway, and somehow that loosens the tension. Someone tosses you an extra scrap of blanket. Another shares a heel of bread. In a few minutes, the room quiets into a strange, uneven rhythm. Snores, creaks, occasional mumbles, but the sharp edge of discomfort fades. There's a scholarly theory about this, that medieval people didn't actually sleep straight through the night. Instead, they practiced segmented sleep, 2 distinct periods broken up by an hour or 2 of wakefulness. During the middle hours, people would talk, tend the fire, pray, even sneak outside for a walk. And in a loft like this, it makes perfect sense. You couldn't toss and turn for hours. You'd wake someone, but sitting up for a bit quietly, that they could manage. There's also the question of trust. In a place like this, you had to read the room, literally. You looked at boots, hands, whether someone carried a dagger strapped to their thigh, if they laid with their back to you or faced the ladder. Survival wasn't just about sharp weapons, it was about sharp instincts. Some inns enforced rules: no weapons in bed, no fighting after sundown. One innkeeper you heard about made people surrender their blades at the door and return them only at dawn. Others posted watchmen at night, not for the guests' safety, but to make sure they paid in the morning. As the hours stretch on, your eyes start to close. The cold is held at bay by body heat and blankets that smell vaguely of goat. And for all the noise and the snoring and the total lack of personal space you feel, safe, or at least safer than outside. Because tonight's survival secret is simple. Sometimes sleeping with one eye open means sleeping beside 6 strangers and hoping none of them kicks. Trust the room. Tuck your pouch under your cloak, and don't roll off the loft. You wake with someone's foot in your ribs, a goat bleating from below, and a tongue that feels like it's been salted and sun-dried. Morning in the inn loft comes not gently, but all at once. Snoring replaced by grumbling, the shuffling of boots, the occasional curse when someone realises their sock is still damp from yesterday, and probably will be tomorrow. You gather your things quietly, tucking your pouch and dignity into your cloak, and climb down the rickety ladder into the common room. The fire's barely embers now, but the air is thick with something sweet and sticky. You follow your nose past the hearth, past the drooling dog curled near the ale barrel, and find the innkeeper bent over a pot, stirring something that glows golden in the firelight. You ask what it is. "Honey," he says, "for the bread." You raise an eyebrow. "Used it on a stab wound last week," he adds, completely deadpan. And just like that, you're introduced to one of the medieval world's most overlooked survival miracles: honey. This isn't just breakfast spread, it's medicine, fire starter, preservation tool, combat bandage. Honestly, you're surprised medieval peasants didn't start worshipping bees outright. You sit down on a bench that creaks under you and tear off a chunk of crusty bread. The innkeeper hands you a dollop of honey on a flat wooden spoon. You smear it across the bread, bite, and immediately forget how tired you are. It's thick, floral, sweet in a way sugar can never quite match. But more than that, it tastes like life, like something warm and alive in a world full of rot and rust. In the Middle Ages, honey wasn't just a treat, it was a necessity. Sugar was rare and expensive, imported from distant lands and hoarded by the wealthy, but honey? That you could make at home, if you were brave enough to deal with the bees. Beekeeping was practically a sacred art. Monasteries were famous for it. Monks kept careful hives, not just for honey, but also for beeswax, which they used in candles and sealants. Nobles valued honey as both a luxury and a survival tool, and peasants, when they could get their hands on some, treated it like gold, sticky gold and delicious gold. But the real magic? Honey doesn't spoil, like ever. Archaeologists have found pots of it in Egyptian tombs, still perfectly edible after thousands of years. In a world where almost everything went rancid, moulded or turned sour, honey was the exception. You could seal fruit in it, herbs, even meat. It preserved things in a sweet little time capsule, and when winter hit hard and supplies ran low, that jar on the shelf could save you. You finish your bread and watch the innkeeper tend to the fire again. Nearby, a woman is rubbing honey onto a cloth and pressing it gently to a man's arm. But she works quickly, layering it with linen and binding it tight. You ask if that's common. Used it on my son when he fell in the river and got cut on a rock, she says. He was turning green by morning, and she's not wrong. Modern science backs her up. Honey is antibacterial, antifungal, even antiviral to some extent. It creates a seal, draws out moisture, and fights off the worst microscopic enemies. The bees did the work so humans could live another day. You learn that on the battlefield, soldiers carried honey in pouches or small clay jars, especially if they couldn't get to a surgeon. No antiseptic, no problem. Smear honey in the wound, wrap it tight, hope for the best. And weirdly enough, it often worked. Better than most of the other options, which included cauterization, wine if you were lucky, or just waiting to die of gangrene. There's even a fringe tale from a passing herbalist who swears that during a siege, he once used honey as a decoy, coated a dead rat in it, left it outside the enemy camp and watched them eat it thinking it was a delicacy. No word on what happened after, but the story got a good laugh around the table. Of course, honey had spiritual weight too. Honey from the rock was mentioned in scripture. In many cultures it symbolized healing, purity, even divine favor. Newborns were sometimes anointed with it, corpses buried with it, wounds blessed using it. You start to understand why it wasn't just in the pantry, it was in the rituals. You help carry a log to the fire and earn another spoonful of the golden stuff for your trouble. This time you just lick it straight off the spoon. No shame, it's warm, it coats your throat. You feel like you could walk 10 more miles on this alone. Some say honey was even used as currency in parts of medieval Europe. A few jars could be bartered for tools, food, cloth. Some landlords demanded it as rent from farmers with wild hives. Imagine paying your taxes in sweet goop. Sounds a lot more tolerable than coin, doesn't it? Before you leave the inn, the keeper hands you a small wax-sealed pouch. Inside is a chunk of comb and a smear of honey wrapped in cloth. For when you can't find a healer, he says, you tuck it into your satchel like a charm. So here's your lesson for today, courtesy of bees and the people smart enough to follow them. When everything else rots, burns or breaks, honey endures. Spread it on bread, smear it on wounds, trade it for favours, treasure it. Because in a world held together by thread and prayer, honey was the closest thing they had to magic. You're walking along a muddy lane lined with broken fences and winter bare hedges, trying to ignore the cold worming its way through your boots again. The honey helped. You can still taste the ghost of it on your tongue, but you're running low on energy and lower on optimism. Then you hear something, a high-pitched squeak, then another, then dozens more overlapping like a shrill little chorus echoing from somewhere just ahead. You stop. There, on the edge of a barn, scurrying along a timber beam just under the thatch is a blur of grey. Then another and another. Rats! You're not surprised to see them. You're surprised how many there are. They move like they own the place, tails flicking, eyes gleaming with that awful beady intelligence. One even pauses to look at you, like it's sizing you up. You take a step back instinctively, and that's when it clicks. This place is in danger. In the medieval world, rats weren't just pests. They were prophets, bad omens with whiskers. You approach the barn cautiously, peering through a cracked door. Inside, hay is scattered, feed sacks torn open, and the faint smell of rot hanging in the air. No animals, no people, just a few panicked chickens clucking in the rafters and that constant skittering sound. You don't need anyone to explain it. This place has been abandoned, and recently. You back away and make your way to the nearest cottage. A woman with wind-reddened cheeks and a face like she's aged in dog years is boiling water over an outdoor fire. She glances at you, then past you. You nod. She doesn't smile. You sit, and she hands you a wooden cup of something bitter and hot. As you sip, she explains what everyone around here knows. Rats move before the plague does, before sickness takes hold, before the coughing starts or the fever spreads, before people even know they're sick. The rats know. They flee. It sounds like folklore, and maybe it is, but as she talks, you realise how seriously they take it. When they come up from the grain cellars during the day, she says, we start boiling everything. In the Middle Ages, people didn't know about Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. They didn't understand how fleas spread disease from rats to humans, but they did notice patterns. And the rats, bold, aggressive, suddenly relocating en masse, were the first and clearest sign that something was wrong. Some families even built rat boards, wooden slats placed across thresholds, smeared with ash or flour to track footprints. If rats were suddenly leaving a building, it meant time to pack your things and leave too. Not tomorrow. Now. You hear another story from a boy no older than 10, barefoot and chewing something unidentifiable. "My uncle says rats talk to death," he says, with all the seriousness a kid can muster. You're not sure if that's horrifying or just oddly poetic. There's even a fringe tale the woman shares, about an old village healer who claimed to divine the health of a household by its rat behaviour. If the rats moved erratically, scattered at night, or hoarded scraps instead of eating them, something was coming. Plague, famine, war. She was eventually driven out, naturally. You can't be too right in a superstitious town. But let's talk facts. Rats thrived where people stored food, especially in villages with granaries, chicken coops, and cosy thatched roofs. When conditions changed, especially when bodies began piling up, the rats would relocate. That movement wasn't just a nuisance, it was a red flag with a tail. People started noticing that the worst outbreaks followed the rats like a shadow. Today, scholars agree the connection between rats, fleas, and plague was very real, even if medieval folks misunderstood the details. Some argue that people saw rats as causes of illness, while others believed they were just messengers. Either way, when the rats left town, smart people followed. Back in the present, you help the woman stack a few logs near her fire. As thanks, she lets you look inside her house. It's small, clean, and smells strongly of herbs. Thyme, sage, a little mint. Everything is suspended from the beams in neat bundles. "They don't like strong smells," she says. "Keeps the fleas down. Even the floor is swept. No crumbs, no feed, nothing to attract tiny invaders." She keeps a cat too, sprawled lazily by the hearth, one eye always half open. "Not good for much now," she says, scratching its ear. And that's your takeaway here. In a world where the unseen could kill you in a week, people didn't wait for symptoms. They watched the signs. Animal behaviour, especially rats, was its own form of news, and unlike town criers or priests, rats didn't lie. So you gather your things and move on before dusk, taking the long way around the rat-infested barn. Your new friend nods in approval. "You've got good sense," she says. "Don't wait till the cough comes." It's not the kind of wisdom you'll find written on a parchment scroll or chanted in a church, but it works, and in the Middle Ages, that's all that mattered. So here's your survival truth for the road. Rats don't run without reason. When they go, you go. Don't ask. Don't argue. Just follow their fear, because they might be vermin, but they're observant vermin, and in this world, that might just keep you alive. The sun is high but weak, pale as milk and barely warming the crown of your hood. The wind settled into a steady nagging whine, not violent, just constant, like the land itself is reminding you that comfort is not part of the deal out here. You've passed 2 more villages, one abandoned, one clinging to life by a thread, and you're starting to get that feeling again, the one that says you might not want to be seen. You duck into a hedgerow and take a slow breath. That's when you see them. 3 figures moving down the track, cloaked, armed, and walking like they own the path. Bandits, probably. Or soldiers on the wrong kind of mission. You freeze. You don't want trouble. You also don't want to get caught hiding like a squirrel in the bramble. You need to vanish. And then, from the back of your travel-worn brain, something rises up. A story you heard in a tavern. A trick used by couriers, smugglers, and clever folk with fewer friends than enemies. You wait until they're out of sight. Then you step onto the path and do something a little unhinged. You put your boots on backwards. It's harder than it looks. Your toes scream in protest, your heels wobble like they're auditioning for a pratfall, and your balance becomes a full-time job. But once you take a few steps and look behind you, it works. Your footprints now point the wrong way. Congratulations. You're using one of the oddest, cleverest survival tactics in the medieval playbook, misdirection by reverse tracks. Back in the day, when travel was risky and banditry a national pastime, people got creative. Soldiers, rebels, even see lovers sneaking away from feuding families, all kinds of folk figured out ways to disappear. And since trails were often watched and footprints could betray your direction, turning them around could buy you time or save your life. You circle back through a ditch, boots squishing and threatening to betray the ruse by throwing you headfirst into the muck. But you make it far enough to create the illusion. Your tracks show someone headed west, when in fact you're veering northeast toward the tree line. Will it work? Maybe, maybe not. But out here, every second of confusion is a second of advantage. This tactic wasn't just some traveller's hack. It was used by spies, outlaws, even entire resistance movements. In one account you overheard in a village alehouse, a group of anti-royalist rebels evaded capture for months by regularly reversing their footwear. They'd walk through rivers, double back through brambles, and yes, wear their shoes backwards until their feet bled. Invisibility through illusion, medieval stagecraft with mud and desperation. You emerge near a brook and rest for a while, boots off, feet red and throbbing. You think about how much of survival isn't about strength or speed, it's about knowing how people think. Tracking was a serious skill in this era. Hunters, rangers, even bounty men trained to read the earth like a book. Broken twigs, disturbed moss, footprints with uneven depth, all clues. And if you could fool the reader, you rewrote your own ending. You wrap your feet and get moving again. Oh, a little slower now. As you travel, you pass a small shrine built beside the path, a worn stone marker with a carved figure, hooded and faceless, with its feet pointing both ways. You laugh softly. Apparently, you're not the first to walk this path backwards. You hear another tale from an old woodsman later that day. He claims he once led a lordsman in circles for hours by switching boots every half mile, sometimes even going barefoot to mix up the prints. Of course, not every tracker was fooled. Some knew the trick and could spot the signs, unusual gait, dragging steps, inconsistencies in weight distribution. But in the right conditions, with snow or loose dirt, it worked just enough to matter. And here's the weird fringe fact. This tactic didn't stop at feet. Some clever folks even shod their horses backwards, nailing the horseshoes in reverse so the prints would point the wrong way. Risky, for sure. One bad step and the horse goes down, but in desperate times, people's got bold. You stop for the night under an old pine, setting the small fire you shield with rocks. You check your tracks one more time, a half proud, half hoping no one follows them at all. The world feels quieter now, like you've slipped into a pocket dimension built for cautious, tired people. You eat a crust of bread and some dried apple, thankful for even this tiny reprieve. Tomorrow you'll put your boots on properly. Probably, but the lesson's not leaving your mind. Out here, when roads are watched and names mean less than footprints, the smartest traveller isn't the fastest. It's the one who knows how to be followed the wrong way. So remember this trick. If they can't find you, they can't rob you. Or worse, let your footprints lie. Let your path confuse, and when in doubt, walk a mile in your own shoes, but backwards. You wake with cold air in your lungs and the musty scent of pine needles under your nose, the fire reduced to a few glowing embers. Your feet are stiff from yesterday's stunt, and your boots look like they've had enough of your nonsense. But you survived the night undisturbed, so maybe walking like a deranged chicken paid off. You stretch, groan, and start packing up camp when a thought crosses your mind. You're almost out of food. You've got a single crust of bread left, cracked and dry like ancient tree bark, and what might be half a turnip if you squint and ignore the mould. You need something better, something that won't spoil by nightfall, something ideally that doesn't crunch when you bite into it like a haunted cracker, and as luck would have it, the next village you wander into has the answer, in a bread oven of all places. The baker is shoveling round loaves from the stone chamber, his arms dusted in ash and flour, sweat glistening despite the cold. You ask him how he keeps the bread from moulding so fast. He shrugs and points to a pile of grey powder in a nearby bucket. Ash, he says. Bit in the dough, bit in the oven. Wait, did he say ash? Yes. You've just stumbled across one of the lesser-known, slightly weird, but wildly effective survival secrets of medieval baking. Putting ash in the dough. You blink at him, expecting a punchline, but he's dead serious. He hands you a warm, round loaf with a darker crust than usual and says, "Still good in 4 days." You bite in. It's earthy, a little gritty, but not bad and not mouldy. That's the part that matters. Turns out wood ash was a cheap, practical preservative, and one that most rural bakers had in abundance. After all, everyone used wood for fuel. What they had left over was ash, and in a world where flour was precious and food went bad faster than you could say day old, people got inventive. Bakers would sift ash into flour to stretch it, yes, but also to help inhibit mould growth. The alkaline nature of ash slowed spoilage, neutralised some bacteria, and gave the bread a slightly tougher crust, which helped seal in moisture and fend off the dreaded fuzzy invaders. Was it delicious? Not exactly, but it was survivable, and that's the whole point out here. You sit by the oven for a while watching the process. The baker uses ash from hardwood, carefully sifted to remove charcoal bits. He adds it in small amounts, almost like salt, just enough to change the pH of the dough without making it taste like a chimney sweep's lunch. Too much, and you'll chip a tooth, he jokes. The man also uses ash in another way. He coats the baking stones with it to prevent sticking, and sweeps the oven with damp ash-soaked rags between bakes to cool the surface and clean off residue. You'd never think of ash as sterile, but here it's practically a medieval cleaning agent. Hot enough, and it kills almost everything, including the smell. And here's where it gets even more interesting. In some regions, people intentionally made ash cakes, a type of flatbread baked directly in ashes, sometimes wrapped in leaves or cloth. They weren't just desperate food, they were travel rations. Soldiers, shepherds, and pilgrims made them on the go. No oven, no tools, just dough and a fire. You bury it in hot embers, wait, dig it out, brush it off, and do it. Crunchy? Yes. Edible? Also, yes. You think back to a fringe story someone told you in another village, about a widow who survived a harsh winter by baking ash bread from potato peels and ground acorns, using a broken hearth in the ruins of a burned chapel. Her only secret? She knew the right kind of wood to burn and the right kind of dough to stretch. Legend says she lived to 90, swearing by ash and lard until the day she died. Modern historians argue over how widespread this practice really was. Some claim the use of ash was minimal, more desperation than strategy. Others insist it was a core part of medieval food culture, especially among the poor who couldn't afford to waste a single crumb. Some archaeological bread samples even show traces of ash and charcoal, suggesting it wasn't just an emergency measure but a recurring method. There's also a medicinal angle. Believe it or not, wood ash was sometimes used as an antacid, either dissolved in water or baked into food for people suffering from sour stomachs. Did it work? Maybe. Did it make the bread taste like regret? Almost certainly. You take another bite and imagine what it must have been like to wake up every day in winter with nothing but ash, a little flouring, and the sheer will to make something that wouldn't rot before nightfall. It's humbling. It also makes you grateful for this ritty, smoky loaf in your hands. It's solid, heavy, reliable. You don't have to worry it'll turn green in your bag tomorrow. The baker hands you 2 extra loaves and wraps them in a strip of old linen. Long road ahead, he says. You laugh, but he's right. Out here you need food that won't betray you. So here's your baked-in survival secret. When everything spoils, burns, or disappears, a little ash might be the thing that keeps you going. It's not fancy, it's not pretty, but it lasts. And out here, that's better than gourmet. You've made it a few miles down the road with your ash bread wrapped tight and bouncing in your satchel, which is now officially the most reliable part of your entire survival kit. The clouds are gathering overhead, sluggish and grey, promising either sleet or worse. You pull your hood up, tuck your chin, and keep walking. By midday you reach the crossroads where 3 muddy lanes meet, marked by an old wooden signpost with letters so worn they've become more of a suggestion than a direction. You stop to rest your legs and chew a little bread, and that's when you notice something strange. A man is standing nearby, cloaked, dusty, and leaning on a carved staff. On his back he carries a small bundle, and something you've seen before in old drawings and strange dreams, a large scallop shell tied to his shoulder and shining faintly through the grime. You ask if he's a merchant. You raise a brow. He smiles, and just like that, you've stumbled into one of the most fascinating medieval survival secrets. Not a weapon, not a tactic, but a symbol, the scallop shell. Known across Europe as the mark of a pilgrim on the road to Santiago de Compostela, the shell did more than decorate a traveller's cloak. It kept people safe in ways the sword never could. The man invites you to walk with him, and you accept. He explains as you trudge side by side, the mud squelching with every step. Pilgrims in the medieval world were part spiritual seekers, part seasoned travellers. They were exempt from certain laws protected by custom, and granted shelter, food, and safety by religious institutions. That is, if they could prove they were genuine. And that's where the scallop shell came in. Worn visibly, often pinned to a cloak, stitched into a hat, or tied to a satchel, it became a kind of medieval passport. It signalled that the wearer was on a holy journey, bound for one of the great pilgrimage sites. In this man's case, it was Santiago in Spain, where the bones of St. James were said to rest. But even people going to Rome, Canterbury, or Jerusalem adopted similar symbols over time. And more importantly, so did the locals. Inns, churches, and town guards learned to recognise it. Pilgrims with shells were less likely to be harassed or turned away. that kind of protection in the medieval world? It were gold, because travel was dangerous, roads were lawless, towns could be hostile, and outsiders were often viewed with suspicion. But if you wore the shell, you weren't just a stranger. You were a traveller of God, and hurting you was seen as an offence to heaven itself. That didn't stop all robbers, of course, but it made them think twice. It also made guards more likely to wave you through gates, and villagers more willing to offer a bed in the barn. You ask if the scallop shell actually worked, or if it was just decoration. The pilgrim stops to pull a small weathered token from his pouch, a wax-sealed letter. "I was given this at the monastery 2 weeks ago," he says, "so it wasn't just show. Pilgrimage had official procedures. You'd receive a blessing, a token, sometimes even a charter of safe conduct. Combined with the shell, this marked you as a participant in a sacred act. Suddenly, that symbol wasn't just a seashell. It was your armour. Some even believed the shell had magical properties. The pilgrim recounts a story, possibly true, possibly not, of a woman attacked by wolves in the Pyrenees who held up her scallop shell and called on St. James. The wolves fled. Whether it was faith or luck, no one knows. But the belief in its power spread. People wore it not just for recognition, but for protection against spirits, disease and misfortune. There's a fringe legend he shares too. In some regions, criminals who repented were forced to go on pilgrimage and wear a special shell marked with red paint. It was a public confession, but also a second chance. Better to walk than to swing, the man says with a shrug. As the afternoon deepens and clouds darken, you pass a village checkpoint. A single bored-looking guard squints at the two of you as you approach. His eyes linger on your muddy boots, then shift to the scallop shell on your companion's shoulder. His expression changes. He steps aside without a word. That's the power of recognition, of symbolic immunity. In a world with no ID cards or passports, people leaned on visible tokens of belonging, whether it was a merchant seal, a guild badge, or a pilgrim's shell. Historians still debate how much protection these symbols actually offered. Some say bandits didn't care about religion. Others argue that attacking a pilgrim could lead to spiritual punishment, real or imagined. Either way, the effect was real. If people believed you were sacred, they treated you as such. By nightfall, you and the pilgrim share a fire outside a half-ruined chapel. He offers you a piece of salted pork and says, "It's not the shell itself. It's what it tells them, that I'm not a threat, that I belong somewhere." You glance at your own cloak, no shell, no symbol, just a hood and a knife and a road that's been too long. He notices and rummages in his pack, pulling out a second scallop, faded but whole. "Here," he says. So tonight's secret, carved into centuries of dusty roads and passed down through every blisters and blessing story told by firelight, is this. Not all protection comes from what you carry. Sometimes it's about what you wear, and what others believe it means. Let the bandits see the shell. Let the gatekeeper wonder. Let superstition do what steel can't. You wear the scallop shell. It feels a little ridiculous at first, just a seashell dangling from your shoulder like an oversized brooch. It swings with each step and taps lightly against your cloak and makes you feel vaguely like a walking trinket stall. But the pilgrim walks beside you like it's second nature. He's not just wearing the shell, he's walking with it. There's something about that. And sure enough, as you pass through the next hamlet, a sagging clutch of timber homes and smoke-dark chimneys, you're greeted with curious looks, but no suspicion. A few nods. One woman even offers a bit of onion-stewed barley from her pot without being asked. She taps the shell and says, "God bless your road," like it's a formality. Just like that, you're not a stranger. You're a type, but that's not the only thing keeping you alive on this leg of the journey. Because your pilgrim companion, who you've learned is called Edric, teaches you something even more critical for survival in the medieval world. You've got to know where the lepers are. You're not sure what you were expecting when he first mentions it. Maybe you pictured bell-ringing skeletons, wrapped in rags and sorrow, hiding in forests like cursed creatures. But the truth is more complicated, and, in some strange ways, more hopeful. Lepers in the Middle Ages weren't always hidden away. In fact, they were part of a well-known, if tragic, infrastructure. As you follow Edric along a winding track past fields of brittle winter barley, he tells you about the leper houses, also known as lazar houses, that dotted the landscape, often at outside towns or along lesser roads. Built to isolate the sick, yes, but also to protect them. These weren't dungeons, they were places of care, of relative peace, even community. You pass one by evening. A small stone building tucked into a grove of withered apple trees, the stones black with moss, but the wooden cross above the door still upright. A single candle glows from within. That surprises you, not because you expected lepers to be unfriendly, but because you never imagined they'd be part of anyone's survival strategy. Then he explains. Leper houses had rules, rituals, and resources. They were often stocked by church tithes, supported by local nobles, and even supplied with basic medical herbs and knowledge, because while people feared contagion, they also feared divine punishment for cruelty. These houses kept small gardens, they raised goats, they had well water, sometimes even their own ovens, and, here's the kicker, they had experience. Experience with disease, injury, and survival at the edge of society. If anyone knew how to treat a festering wound or a gut turned sour from bad water, it was the people who lived here. You're quiet for a while after that. There's a fringe story Edric shares as you settle by the fire that night, camped in the shelter of a broken wall just out of sight from the road. He speaks of a knight who fell in battle, left for dead, his side torn open. It wasn't a surgeon or nobleman who saved him, but a group of lepers who took him in, cleaned the wound, fed him goat milk, and prayed over him for a month. When he recovered, he returned to his lord's service, but wore a piece of their tunic beneath his armour for the rest of his life. No one knew, but he said it made him stronger. You ask why lepers would help anyone, especially strangers. Edric shrugs. When you've already been cast out, what more do you have to lose? It's a haunting kind of logic. Out here, exile strips away layers, reputation, wealth, ego. What's left is raw humanity. And sometimes the people society throws out are the ones who remember how to care for others. You also learn the practical side of this survival link. Some leper houses kept herb gardens with wormwood, sage, comfrey, and thyme. They dried herbs in bunches and made salves, syrups, even vinegar tinctures. And because no one wanted to visit them unless they had to, they learned to be entirely self-sufficient. It wasn't uncommon for travellers, especially other outcasts, pilgrims, and desperate peasants, to quietly visit the edges of leper grounds at night, leaving offerings in exchange for medicine, a coin, a loaf, or just a whispered prayer for healing. In return, the lepers left bundles of dried leaves or pots of balm at the stone boundary walls. That, Edric says, is the unspoken rule. You respect their space and they respect your need. Don't cross the threshold without cause. Don't speak unless you must. But honour them, and they might just help you when no one else will. You drift to sleep under your threadbare cloak with your back to the wall and Edric humming a hymn. You think about the lives built out of exclusion, the gardens behind old stone walls, the people who no longer had names in the eyes of the world, but who still grew things, still healed, still helped. And you realise this survival truth is bigger than strategy or gear or clever tricks. It's about who the world forgets and what they remember. Here's the lesson scratched in moss and candlelight. Survivors recognise survivors, and sometimes the safest hands are the ones the world won't shake. If you find a leper house, be kind, be respectful, be quiet. You might walk away with more than medicine, you might walk away alive. The next morning you part ways with Edric at a fork in the road. He's heading west toward a distant monastery, while your path winds north through the highlands. Then he's gone, shell glinting faintly in the grey light, a pilgrim disappearing into the mist like he was never really there. You keep walking, the air grows colder, thinner and meaner. The trees are sparse now, twisted things clawing at the sky, and the wind roars like it's got something personal against you. You haven't seen another soul for hours, until out of nowhere you spot a flicker of movement ahead, just a figure, hunched near a stone outcrop, hands clasped in silent prayer. You hesitate. There's something eerie about him, like he was carved out of the landscape itself. Then you realise what you're looking at. A hermit. He doesn't acknowledge you, doesn't move, just sits there, wrapped in rags, hood shadowing his face. A rough cross is propped up beside him, and a few clay bowls sit near his feet, each with a scrap of bread or coin someone must have left. A faint smell of smoke and herbs lingers in the air. You inch closer, cautious but curious, and in that moment you remember something Edric told you the night before. If the wars ever reach you, and you have nowhere to hide, find the hermits. In the Middle Ages, when chaos rolled across the land in waves, whether it was famine, plague, or feudal war, some people didn't run. They simply disappeared into holiness. And that wasn't just a spiritual calling, it was a survival tactic. See, If you claim to be a hermit or a holy man, especially one devoted to solitude and prayer, you could live in the hills, eat next to nothing, and most importantly be left alone. Because nobody wanted to mess with God's loners, not even bandits. You finally greet the man, offering him a small piece of your ash bread. He doesn't speak, but he nods slowly. A subtle blessing maybe, or maybe just acknowledgement that you're not here to rob him. You sit nearby, careful to leave space. Over time, hermits gained a kind of mythic status in medieval society. They were seen as close to the divine, part prophet, part cautionary tale. Some claimed visions, some were said to heal the sick, others just sat in silence for decades. And because they were tied to religious belief, they were often protected, even revered. You could be dirt poor and dressed like compost, but if people thought you were touched by heaven, they'd give you food. Or more importantly, not stab you. There's a fringe tale from the northern counties about a deserter from a brutal feudal skirmisher who wandered into the hills, shaved his head and lived in a cave. He painted symbols on the walls, mumbled nonsense, and refused to speak to anyone except a goat. Over time, they began leaving offerings at the cave. When the plague came through, his valley was untouched. Coincidence? Maybe, but the story stuck. You're starting to understand the strategy. Disappear into something sacred. When the world's burning down, holiness is an invisibility cloak. Of course, not everyone was a true ascetic. There were plenty of fake hermits too, men, and sometimes women, who wore rags, smeared ash on their faces, and adopted the rituals of solitude, all to avoid the draft, the taxman, or the gallows. And it worked. People didn't challenge the mad prophet in the woods. They dropped coins in his bowl and walked away. Scholars debate how many of these solitary figures were legitimate religious devotees versus opportunists, but in truth it didn't matter. The results were the same. They were avoided. And sometimes, in a world this brutal, avoidance is better than armour. The man beside you still hasn't spoken, but now he pulls out a small string of bone-carved beads and begins to thumb them rhythmically. You mimic the motion with your hands, not the beads, just the motion. Something about it feels right. Soothing. The two of you sit like that for an hour, maybe more, as the wind moves through the high grasses. When you finally stand to leave, he looks up, his face weathered but calm, like old stone shaped by time. He reaches out and places a small wooden token in your hand. It's carved with a crude image of an open eye. No words, just the gift. You bow slightly and leave, clutching the token in your hand like it might mean something later. Spoiler, it will. By nightfall, you reach a sheltered outcropping with dry leaves and decent cover. As you make your small fire and eat a bit more of the slowly hardening bread, you think about the man on the hillside, about the way solitude can be armour, about how disappearing in plain sight is sometimes the smartest move of all. So here's your survival secret tonight, whispered in prayers and blown across windswept hills. If you can't outrun the world, vanish from it. Become something too sacred to touch, too strange to bother, too silent to suspect. Sometimes the best way to survive isn't to fight, it's to fade. You're getting closer to the edge of the kingdom now, whatever that means out here, where borders shift with every lord's whim and every warband's path. The villages have thinned, the roads have become suggestion more than structure, and even the birds seem less inclined to sing. You're not entirely sure where you're going anymore, but that's kind of the point. You're surviving. That's enough. But today, something shifts. You spot a small crowd gathering in the clearing ahead, men and boys, most of them ragged, some holding what could charitably be called bows. A few arrows are being tested, others fletched. You keep your distance, watching from behind a tangle of brambles, until someone near the edge of the group calls out to you. "You there?" You hesitate. Not exactly the greeting you were hoping for, but he waves you over, not with menace, but with a grin. Turns out you've just walked into an illegal archery practice. And here comes your final survival secret, the power of the longbow, and why peasants trained with it even when they weren't allowed to. Now, on paper, English law in the late medieval period actually encouraged archery among commoners. In fact, there were mandates that every man must practice archery on Sundays, instead of playing football or drinking themselves into a ditch. The reason? War. Specifically England's endless squabbles with France, Scotland, and occasionally itself. Longbows were cheap, deadly, and easy to train. If you had 100 peasants and enough string, you could field an army. But here's the twist. In many places, that permission only applied when the Lord said so. And in turbulent regions, especially ones where rebellion simmered just beneath the surface, Training with a bow could make you a suspect, or worse, a threat. So people trained in secret, like this group here. You join them, awkwardly at first. They hand you a bow that's nearly your height, the wood dark with age and sweat. It's no toy. You notch an arrow, pull back, and realise instantly, this takes strength. The draw weight on a proper warbow is intense, sometimes over 100 pounds. Your arms shake. You release. The arrow flies wide, thunking into a tree like a sulking bee. The boys laugh, not unkindly. One of them, maybe 12 years old, lands 3 shots in a row on a straw-stuffed target. You notice the finger guards on his string hand. These aren't play archers. They're training like they mean it. A grizzled man with a permanent squint and arms like braided rope gives you pointers. Don't pull with your arms. Use your back. You adjust. Try again. The second shot lands closer. You nod. He nods. You're in. Here's what you learn. Archery was one of the only martial skills available to the poor. Swords were expensive, armor even more so, but a bow? You could carve one yourself. Arrows were harder to make, but even broken ones could be reshaped, repaired, reused. And more than that, a bow let you kill from a distance. It gave you power without needing permission. There's a story told around the fire as the sun dips low about a village that held off a group of mercenaries during the 100 Years' War with nothing but longbows and a clever use of ditches. They never even saw our faces, someone says. The longbow was more than a weapon. It was an equalizer. On the battlefield, a trained archer could pierce armor at 200 yards. A well-placed volley could disrupt cavalry, break a siege, or pin down an entire line of knights. You didn't need noble blood to kill a noble, just steady hands and decent range. But that's also why archery could get you in trouble. Lords wanted peasants who could fight in their wars, not organise their own. In secret, these gatherings also became a kind of militant community. Rebellion always simmered beneath them, especially in times of famine or unfair taxation. Some of these men have scars they won't talk about. Others wear rings made from bent arrowheads, like quiet promises. You're offered a drink, herb ale, bitter but warm. The older man leans close. Out here, we don't trust steel. Steel needs a forge. There's a fringe legend he tells you then, about a blind archer who could shoot by sound alone, trained by monks in a remote abbey. He supposedly took down a mounted knight in open battle by listening to the horse's breath. It's probably nonsense, but in the dark, around a fire, it sounds like gospel. Before you leave, they offer you a token of passage, a short hunting bow, strung and waxed, with 3 arrows wrapped in cloth. Not a war bow, but enough to feed you, or defend you. You've got eyes, the boy says, handing it over. You nod, you will. So tonight's survival secret isn't just a weapon, it's a mindset. It's the knowledge that you don't need a castle or a title to be dangerous, just patience, practice, and a sharp point. When everything else is taken, land, coin, name, the longbow gives you reach, gives you silence, gives you a say. Pull the string, steady your breath, and remember, out here, the hand that draws first survives. By now, your boots feel more like rumours than footwear, held together with hope and a few desperate knots of leather thong. You're somewhere in the high valleys, where the land rolls open like an old blanket and the wind whistles every hour of the day. The longbow rides light on your back, swaying with each step, a quiet reminder that you've learned how to watch, wait, and act. But the sun's dipped low, and you're exhausted in that full-body, bone-sinking way that makes even walking feel like too much. You need shelter, not just rest under a tree, but real body-warming, wind-blocking shelter. There are no villages in sight, just scattered stone walls and the occasional smoke trail in the distance. You follow one, threading your way across scrub and sheep trails, until you come upon a small farmstead. At first glance, it's nothing special, a low cottage, a chicken hutch, a lopsided barn. But what catches your attention is the lowing of animals and the open barn door. You head toward it, hoping not to spook anyone. A child peeks from the main house window, disappears, then reappears again. You raise a hand in greeting and gesture toward the barn. And just like that, you're in. This is another medieval survival trick you'd never consider in a world with radiators and central heating. But back then, sleeping near livestock wasn't just a backup plan, it was part of the blueprint. You step into the barn and are greeted by heat, real honest warmth, heavy with the sense of hay, dung and life. Cows are tucked in on one side, their sides rising and falling in time with their cud-chewing dreams. A few sheep lie curled in the straw. In the far corner, a goat eyes you like you might be trouble, which to be fair you are. You find an open spot in the straw, tuck your bag under your head, and stretch out beside the closest cow, who shifts slightly but doesn't complain, and just like that your body starts to thaw. This was no accident of desperation. Medieval peasants built their homes with this in mind. In many rural areas, especially across northern Europe, cottages were designed with animals and people under the same roof, sometimes in separate stalls, sometimes only divided by a low wall or wooden partition. Why? Body heat. Livestock generate a ridiculous amount of warmth. A single cow radiates enough to raise the temperature of a small enclosed space by several degrees. Multiply that by a few sheep, maybe a goat or two, and suddenly your icy stone hut becomes a halfway decent refuge from winter's bite. Add a thatched roof and mud-sealed walls, and you're practically living in luxury. Sure, there were downsides. Smell, obviously, noise, occasional trampling if someone rolled the wrong way in their sleep. But when the choice was freeze or snuggle up with a pig, most people didn't hesitate. You can't smell when you're dead. You breathe it in, the warm breath of the cows fogging the air, the rustle of hay, the sound of something chewing nearby in the dark. It's oddly comforting. The animals sleep better than humans, less worry maybe, or just simpler expectations. There's even an old belief still whispered in some corners that sleeping with animals could ward off illness. Not because of science, but because people associated livestock with fertility, strength and life. Being near them was seen as anchoring, grounding. You didn't just survive the night, you were blessed by it. You recall an old woman in a village you passed 2 weeks ago who swore her son survived the worst winter in living memory by sharing a bed with their donkey. Ugly beast, but warm as a hearth, she said with a proud smile. Never complained once, either. Of course not all animals were welcomed into homes. Chickens were too chaotic, geese too mean, and pigs, well, pigs had their own corner, usually outside or in a pen. But cows and sheep, those were like family. Milk, wool, meat, every part of them was survival. So sharing warmth, just another kind of exchange. The scholarly types still debate whether this practice was purely functional or had deeper roots. Some argue that it was cultural, a holdover from ancient traditions of humans and animals cohabiting as equals. Others say it was just pragmatic economics. If you're cold and the cow is warm, you and the cow are now roommates. End of story. There's even a fringe tale that some monks in colder monasteries took vows to sleep among livestock during Lent, to remind themselves of humility and the shared nature of creation. Whether that's true or not, you've never felt more human than right now, stretched out next to a gently farting ox. As the barn grows quiet, you pull your cloak tighter, now lined with extra straw. There's a soft grunt from the goat corner, then silence. You sleep deeper than you have in days. And in the middle of the night, you wake just long enough to feel the cow's flank rise and fall beside you. Slow, rhythmic, steady, alive. Here's your secret tonight, whispered in the warm breath of animals and the creak of ancient barns. Sometimes survival means remembering you're part of the herd. You don't always need walls, you don't need a fire. Sometimes you just need warmth, any warmth, and the humility to take it where it's offered. Sleep near the cows, let the barn become your castle, and thank the goat in the morning even if he stares at you like you owe him money. Money.